Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this year's Policy Forum on Identity, Authentication, and the Road Ahead. I'm Jeremy Grant. I'll be your MC for the next 2 days. I'm a Managing Director in Venable's Cybersecurity and Privacy Practice. I also serve as Coordinator of the Better Identity Coalition and an advisor to the FIDO Alliance. I'm thrilled that once again, both of these groups are able to partner with the ID Theft Resource Center on what has become the best event each year, looking at a range of policy issues around identity and authentication. I'm a little less thrilled we're doing this once again as a virtual conference. When we first announced things in December, we were hoping it could be a hybrid event with some in-person and virtual components, but Omicron has not been our friend here. The good news, though, is that making this virtual allows for a lot more people to participate. We've got more than 800 people registered today. As we look at the policy landscape in 2022, COVID is continuing to significantly impact the identity and authentication landscape, and not in particularly great ways. We're now coming up on the 2-year anniversary of a global pandemic that has fundamentally changed how we work, shop, learn, apply for government services, with the biggest impact being that for a long time, in-person transactions became impossible, and we're still not quite back to what once was. And much as the way that we do business has rapidly shifted to digital channels, the way that criminals and fraudsters and other adversaries are attacking us, that's moved to the digital channel as well, with a particular focus on exploiting weaknesses in digital identity infrastructure to launch attacks. Back in 2019, CISA declared identity was what they called a national critical function, defined as those functions of government in the private sector so vital to the US that their disruption, corruption, or dysfunction would have a debilitating effect on the security, national economic security, national public health or safety, or any combination thereof. And I don't think anything has brought that point home, that identity really is a national critical function, quite as efficiently as this pandemic. It's clear that without some significant policy changes and a way for government to start giving new tools to people to protect themselves, our digital identity infrastructure is going to continue to be deficient. I think that's a key point we want to drive home over these next 2 days. The government has a meaningful role to play in addressing these issues, not just because of the role of inadequate digital identity infrastructure, enabling adversaries to steal money and data, but also because of the impact that these attacks have on individuals. In 2020, nearly half of all Americans were victims of financial identity theft. Losses from identity theft increased 42%. The Federal Trade Commission reported identity theft tied just to government benefits skyrocketed by nearly 3,000% in 2020. And for those in the margins of society, the poor, many people of color, those living with disabilities, the inadequacies of our digital identity systems have in many cases exacerbated existing inequities. We can do better. So this event's been unique in that the 3 organizations that partner to jointly produce it have focused on trying to tell as many different aspects of this story, not just talking about security and fraud, but also highlighting how it actually impacts people from all different walks of life and how the solutions that work for some people may not work for others. Identity is really complicated. There's a lot of different facets to the issue. There might not be easy answers to all of them, We hope to shine a light on as many of these topics as we can here the next 2 days. So let me just give you an overview of what to expect. In terms of logistics, this event's being simulcast live, both on the Zoom platform and on a YouTube channel. Everything's being recorded. It'll be archived on YouTube shortly after the event. We have a chat function open. We also have a Q&A tab that if you want to submit a question for a speaker, I can't promise everybody will get to it, given that we've got a tight schedule, but it'll at least be there for the session moderators to look at. So today we're going to hear from James Lee, from the ID Theft Resource Center shortly after an opening keynote. And James is going to talk about the new ITRC annual data breach report, which will provide some excellent, though kind of depressing statistics and data as to the scope of the problem, not just in government, but across the country. From there, we'll be turning to discussions on what we can do to address some of these problems to make things better. Tanya Riley will moderate a panel that dives deeper into the identity challenges associated with pandemic unemployment benefits. There, we're going to hear from leaders from the Department of Labor, a vendor who's helped states with identity vetting, as well as those who have been advocates for some of the beneficiaries and helped them when state ID verification programs didn't work as well as everybody hoped they would have. We'll then take a 15-minute break. You can get a bite to eat, take a break from the screen. Starting at 1 o'clock Eastern, I will moderate a panel looking specifically at what government can do to help here. We'll have representatives from federal agencies like GSA and TSA, as well as from Congress, all talking about the ways government can play a bigger role in addressing critical identity challenges. We'll follow that with a panel looking at the topic of identity, the individual, and inclusion, diving into when some of our systems fall down for our fellow Americans and what we need to do as government and industry to address those issues. I think a point I'd make here is, as somebody who's historically come at identity from more of a security mindset, I was for many years not paying much attention to the fact that when we focus just on security aspects when designing these types of systems, it can create some real hardships for people. And I think as we become more dependent on digital identity systems, the challenges that these solutions might create can be pretty notable. It's time to talk about that more. It's time to look for ways that we can do better. Let me just give you a quick preview as well of tomorrow. The morning's largely going to focus on authentication. The afternoon will focus on next generation digital ID proofing. We'll start with a keynote from Eric Mill, who's part of the White House Office of Management and Budget. He'll be discussing the government's new zero trust strategy and the role that strong phishing resistant authentication like FIDO plays in it. Then we'll hear from Andrew Shikiar, who runs the FIDO Alliance, who will provide some perspectives from the industry side. We'll then have a panel on how government and industry are rethinking authentication, hosted by the government's former CISO, Grant Schneider. The afternoon's going to shift to a panel looking at next generation digital identity proofing, including a spotlight session with the FDIC's Chief Innovation Officer and the lead for digital ID at FinCEN, talking about their newly announced tech sprint on measuring the effectiveness of digital identity proofing. And then we'll have a closing keynote from Elizabeth Rosenberg, who was just confirmed last month as the Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes at the Treasury Department. So let's get back to day one and start off with the program. This morning, I'm thrilled that for an opening keynote, we're going to do something a little different in the form of a fireside chat. And I'm thrilled that Susan Gibson, who leads work in the government's Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, known as the PRAC, she leads their work group on identity, fraud reduction, and redress, and has agreed to speak with us today. So let me welcome in Susan Gibson, who's going to talk a little bit more about what's happening there. I also want to change, since we said it's a fireside chat and we're on Zoom, I have a special Zoom background just for our session where you'll see we are burning the things we really want to stop, benefits fraud and identity theft. So hopefully that helps to set the tone for a good discussion for the next half hour. But welcome, Susan. Thanks. Why don't you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about the PRAC?
I will. Thanks, Jeremy. Love your background. Thanks for inviting me to join you today. My thanks to the Better Identity Coalition, the ITRC, and the FIDO Alliance for hosting this event, and also, Jeremy, for your support of the PRAC's efforts to tackle identity fraud issues. You've been talking to us for several months, and we really appreciate it. For anyone who isn't familiar with the PRAC, it's a committee of 22 inspectors general, or IGs, that was formed under the CARES Act to serve the American public by both promoting transparency and facilitating coordinated oversight of the federal government's pandemic response and the associated $5 trillion in spending. The transparency goal is mainly supported by the PRAC's website, pandemicoversight.gov, where they've rounded up lots of pandemic spending data and all of the oversight reports and related information. They've made all of this information and data available and accessible with wonderful graphics, interactive search capabilities, and the ability for organizations to download a lot of the data and do their own analysis. There are also several targeted PRAC subcommittees and working groups. As Jeremy mentioned, I chair the PRAC's Identity Fraud Reduction and Redress Working Group, which was established last summer to focus on reducing the ability of criminals to obtain the government benefits on the front end, and also better oversight of the programs for redressing the harm to victims of identity theft and identity fraud. As Jeremy mentioned, the impacts to the victims just really they're so much broader than most people consider, and the more you delve into it, the more troubling it gets. The IGs on the PRAC also work closely with the FBI and other law enforcement agencies to investigate pandemic fraud. To date, these efforts have resulted in over 1,100 indictments and nearly 400 convictions. While these results are impressive, it would obviously be better for everyone if we could reduce those numbers on the front end. It'd be better for the taxpayers, better for these programs, and so much better for the victims of identity fraud. So that's what my working group is trying to bring more focus to. And I'm thrilled to be here to talk about it today. And Jeremy, where do you want to take it from here?
Well, thanks, Susan. I wanted to start with the number you mentioned, $5 trillion in terms of the total value of pandemic aid. So our total GDP in 2020 was about $20 trillion, which means that's roughly a quarter of the GDP that was sent out during the pandemic response, which is a ton of money to try to distribute securely and accurately and quickly to people who need help. So I think we've learned now we didn't have the systems in place to do all of these things securely, accurately, quickly. What are some of the biggest gaps that you and the PRAC work group have identified on the identity side in terms of like what didn't we have in place then that we ought to really be thinking about now in terms of, a potential future crisis?
Jeremy, there's so much to talk about there. It's hard to know where to start. I think some of the things that weren't in place in particular were the general infrastructure to deal with this on this broad of a scale. As you say, $5 trillion is a huge amount of money, and it was spread across all these different programs. Some of them overlapped. Most of them were administered in a distributed way, right? It was the states that were administering the unemployment insurance programs. The PPP loans were individual banks. And so people were going in through all these avenues trying to get these benefits from the government. And when these different states and whatnot weren't talking to each other, I think it made it that much easier for the criminals to find those seams and gaps in the fraud protections. I think one of the reports that the Department of Labor, OIG, did found that one Social Security number was used to apply for unemployment insurance in 29 different states. So the ability to do that and not have at least one of those states, before they gave the money out, say, hey, is this Social Security number being used somewhere else? Something that simple wasn't in place. The problems compounded by old IT systems in a lot of the states that just wasn't ready to handle this. A bunch of state and federal employees who are now working from home and perhaps didn't have all of the resources available to them they would have had if they'd been in the office. As I said, it just goes on. And then everyone who's listening to this pretty much knows that authentication is just not where it should be in general. So when you add that amount of money, which is a huge target, I mean, how can the criminals resist? You add that amount of money without any improvements to the system and without the right data sharing. And I think this is where we end up, unfortunately.
On the data sharing side, I mean, you mentioned this, one person using the same SSN in 29 states. Are we seeing things in place now where that isn't still possible because we've put some checks and balances in place where, states can check with each other? Or are we still dealing with a lot of these issues, these holes that haven't really been closed?
I think some improvements have been made. I don't really have the data on whether all of these have been corrected at this point. I'd be surprised, quite frankly, because of the antiquated systems in some of the states and because of just the general attitude of states not wanting to sort of share the information in bulk. So, doing these one-off checks is a lot more time consuming and a lot harder than agreements to share in bulk. and sharing personal information, depending on a state's laws or the federal laws, can be very, very difficult. I think some of the privacy protections that were put in place before we really had the internet even don't work so well in this time and age. And I think we need to find new ways to share that information while still appropriately protecting the privacy. And when we get to that, where it can be done at scale and not just one-off, which is hard to do when you've got the numbers that we've had during the PRAC, I think we'll start seeing more progress in this area. And I think it's something that in the future, for these sorts of programs, Congress is going to have to think about, right? Hey, state X or bank Y, if you want to participate in this program, a certain amount of information sharing and data gathering and fraud protection and better authentication is going to have to be part of that before this huge amount of federal money is made available.
Mm-hmm. On that front, and I realize that the PRAC's still putting together its formal recommendations, are there things that you guys are looking at that could be things that the government could potentially do, but where some new legal authorities are going to be needed to make it happen?
Oh, I think we're early on to talk about the legal authorities. Some of the things that I mentioned before, I think they're going to have to start tackling, and a lot of that's with the information sharing and the data gathering and the better authentication. Some of the other things you've mentioned already, so much of this happens online, and some of it you have to be pretty sophisticated even to use something like login.gov and always have access, remember your passwords, remember what email address you used when you first set up your account, things like that. I think, we need to remember that there's a certain population out there that just can't use the internet or won't use the internet or aren't proficient. So we're looking at some ways to provide in-person authentication, both to get the benefit, and then if they think they're a victim of identity fraud, also then how do you go in and authenticate that you're the real person and not the person who got your benefits? So those are some of the recommendations and things we're looking at. Depending on how that service is provided, that might require some legislation to authorize that and clearly to pay for it. So that would be an improvement that could be made. I think just requiring the sort of fraud protections that everybody knows are a good idea. This isn't a new problem. And if you go into recommendations that the IRS IG, TIGTA, has been making for over a decade, when this started with the tax returns and the fraud on the payments, they made recommendations on data matching. Why are you sending all of this money that's supposed to be for 5 different people to one bank account? So even looking at that kind of information. So those recommendations are out there. Some have been acted on, not all. Again, the distributed nature of this with the banks and the states and the local and the feds I think, complicates it. It's a hugely complex system and a lot of benefit programs.
I'd agree. Do we, the estimates that we've seen in terms of what was actually lost, particularly on the pandemic unemployment insurance side, numbers have sort of been all over the place. I know for a while there were people citing Labor Department IG numbers. The last number I think was 87 billion. There's been some private estimates saying it could be 400 billion, other numbers in between. Do we know what the actual number is, or if we don't today, do we think we'll have a good one in the future?
I don't think we have a lot of estimates. And as you say, the estimates vary pretty widely. We don't have a good number. It's one of the things that the PRAC is working on. If you look at all the data that they're gathering, that they're putting up on pandemicoversight.gov, if you start talking about all of the spending that has happened and categorizing it and tracking it, and try to look at that fraud as the investigations progress, I think eventually we'll get there. Of course, not all of the 5 trillion has been spent. So, we still have those programs to go. And some of the programs have different vulnerabilities. Unemployment insurance, we've talked about. A lot of individual identity theft and fraud is uncovered in the unemployment insurance realm. I think when you get to things like PPP that the businesses were applying for, we're going to see a completely different profile on that. Because again, those were businesses. I think we're going to see more synthetic IDs there and less identity theft, because it's easier to make up a business or to make a business look bigger than it is. just stand up a shell and turn it into a business, if you will. Plus, those PPP loans, you don't have to start paying them back for 2 years. So I think when people start getting noticed to pay back a loan that they never applied for, that's when we're really going to start uncovering the PPP fraud. So that, I think that's in the distance. So I think it's going to take time to gather more data. We're working on it at the PRAC. Certainly hope to get there, but I couldn't put a number on it. That said, one of the things I tell people, regardless of which number you pick, it's blazingly obvious that we'd be better off spending some of that money on the front end, right? Not recovering everything and trying to stop it after the fact and going after the criminals, which we need to do. But if some of that investment could go to the front end, to better authentication, to updated IT systems, to working on the data sharing and putting the analytics in place so that you can uncover these fraud schemes and share that information, it would be a much better use of taxpayer funds.
Yeah. Now, I think you get to a point where when all of the numbers being thrown around are bigger than the Department of Homeland Security's annual budget. At some point, the question becomes less a matter of, okay, what is the actual number? And okay, if we recognize this is a real problem, what do we actually do about it? Let me actually shift a little bit there. I want to dive a little bit more into identity theft and identity fraud. This is an identity conference after all. How is it that criminals were so able to easily steal money from programs using compromised or stolen identities?
Well, to some extent, I think given the nature of the pandemic and the nature of the pandemic relief, Congress was very explicit about the fact that they were more concerned about getting money out the door to people who needed it quickly. So some of these programs, people were allowed to get benefits just based on their own statement that, yes, I was a gig economy worker, for example. So even if that data matching had been in place, how do you data match somebody who claims to be a self-employed gig worker? So I think some of the efforts to get this relief to people swiftly, which were very well intentioned and obviously necessary, also opened the door to all kinds of fraud possibilities. And I'll go back to, you look at the states and the unemployment insurance, the huge amount of money, the IT systems that just were not anywhere close to being able to handle it. And the incentive for the criminals who have a lot more resources, right? They've got smart people figuring out how to break in, and they've got a huge incentive for that. So I think you combine those good intentions, trying to get things out quickly, that just opened up new problems. And I tell people all the time, we still need to talk about identity theft and teach people how to keep their identities safe. But that horse has left the barn. There are so many identities that are already out there on the dark web to buy, and so many data breaches. I think the ITRC is going to talk next about that. And just the volume of personally identifiable information, the things that identify all of us, social security numbers, things like that, they're out there. So really, we need to focus less on trying to fix it by stopping identity theft and focus more on how do you get to that authentication with a realization that the identity theft has already happened. That is a fact of life. Now that changes sort of what you have to focus on to stop this sort of fraud.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, the one thing we've talked about quite a bit from the coalition's perspective is it's time to perhaps, abandon some sacred cows, like telling people that they can somehow protect their social security number if they just keep their card locked up in a safe and don't give it to anybody, because you generally need to give that number out once a month because you're alive. And, life sort of, demands it, which, I've pointed out we were always sort of doomed to end up where we are right now with SSNs, where, shared secrets don't stay secret for long. But, the issue isn't necessarily replacing the SSN, but how do we build identity systems that don't ascribe any security value to knowledge of the social security number? It's just an identifier that happens to point out which Susan Gibson you are versus, I imagine, several hundred or several thousand others in the US. But just because it doesn't mean it's you. It just means That's, the one identity we're talking about. And also, as you're talking about this, I mean, I'm reminded it was around 2 years ago, I guess not quite at this time, but when things were starting to hit in March, and I started getting calls from friends and agencies, who I'd worked with when I was in government, saying, it looks like we're going to be getting a lot of money. What do we do on the identity verification side? Because we're going to be under pressure to get it out the door quick. And, we're worried about fraudsters. And I remember having a discussion with, a friend in one agency. This is a little bit like Donald Rumsfeld talked about with the Army when we, went into Iraq in 2003. He said, you go in with the Army you have, not necessarily the one you want. And I said, look, in the coalition, we've got a lot of ideas, as our policy blueprint in terms of what you can do in a couple of years to get better systems in place. But right now, you're going to have to scramble to leverage what we have. And I, think unfortunately, we've seen, the results of that. But, talking a little bit about where we've been focusing from the coalition, if we had more robust digital identity infrastructure in place, when this started a couple of years ago, let's say people had a mobile driver's license app on their phone that they could use. How could that have impacted things? How would outcomes have been a little bit different compared to what we saw?
That's not one I've given much thought to. I mean, you would hope there would be less fraud, right? I mean, if you've got better authentication, that should be an outcome of it. Getting to that point, I think, is going to be really hard. One of the things that we keep talking about inside government, and I've talked to some of the government research agencies about, is getting to this authentication. But at the same time, there's just no appetite, right, for some sort of a federal identity card or identity app or something. I mean, you even saw what happened when people thought they had to put their vaccine identity stuff maybe in an app on their phone. So that makes it difficult, right? The freedoms that we're expecting in this country, the way that people want to protect their privacy and their information. So I think if we'd had some of that in place, it clearly would have made a difference. I think getting it in place is going to remain difficult, and we're going to have to find some really creative ways to do authentication that are effective and acceptable in an open democracy like the United States. So I think that's going to be a problem. One of the interesting things that we're also working on right now, and one of the things we're turning to that I'd like to talk about before we run out of time, is also the impact on victims, and the fact that, we can talk about the fact that the authentication programs weren't in place. But the other problem is there's not absolutely nothing, but there's very little being done for victims of identity fraud, for the people who go to apply for their unemployment insurance and find out somebody got it ahead of them. So it takes them weeks or months to even get a call back when they report. And this is somebody who needs their unemployment insurance. By the time they get helped, are they also homeless? Are their children hungry? Their credit rating is a mess. I mean, you just think of all the things that flow from that, and really the programs are not set up at all. And I think that's the other thing that we found was woefully inadequate. People didn't even have a way to report, let alone a way to say, hey, this is the real me. Can you authenticate that it's me and give me the stuff that I'm entitled to? And so that's the other thing that we're really starting to focus on now. In my working group, because as we're still focusing on reducing it on the front end, but there's nobody else hardly, other than maybe the ITRC, who's focusing on taking care of the victims. And really the government needs to be a big part of that solution, because they're a big part of the problem.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, I may have mentioned to you before we were talking, is 10 days ago, my best friend called me. Somebody in DC had applied for unemployment in his name and he was aware of it. What do I do? And I said, you can call the ID Theft Resource Center. There's, law enforcement angle, but as much time as I spend in this space, people don't know what to do. And, going back to the issue of, what don't we have in place? I think you raised a great point. I mean, look, this is not something you're going to solve with a national ID card. In fact, one of the things we pointed out in our policy blueprint was it's kind of an outdated idea for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, it's a political non-starter, but two, part of our problem these days is we've got too many cards or too many physical documents, the passport, the driver's license, the birth certificate. They're all stuck in the paper and plastic world, and transactions are digital online. And, what we've been calling for from the coalition is not to create new systems that are going to raise security, privacy, civil liberties concerns, but just look to come up with some sort of a way to close this gap between the physical and the digital, so that much as I can go to a bank and by handing over my card to the bank, they know who I am or have a decent level of assurance. How can I present those credentials online or ask for them to be validated, ask for an agency to vouch for me? And so, there's where we think that there's, an important role for government to play, since government's the only authoritative issuer of identity, while still respecting some of the boundaries that we've had and not creating, new systems that are going to raise some of these bigger concerns. So let me, we don't have a ton of time left on this panel, but, let me ask, in terms of what's next from the PRAC, what sort of recommendations on what government should do here, do we expect to see coming out from your work group and the PRAC in the months ahead?
I think you'll see a lot of the same recommendations that we've seen already, unfortunately. And a lot of those are all rolled up on the pandemicoversight.gov website. IGs are doing the oversight to make recommendations for improvements. Everything that we've been talking about, better authentication on the front end, data sharing, really paying attention to those fraud indicators. The same IP addresses, the same physical addresses being used multiple times, social security numbers used multiple times. So I think we'll see recommendations along those lines. For the PRAC, we're also looking ahead. Like I said, my working group in particular is now really shifting its focus to the victim end of this, because that seems to be the part that has so little focus at the moment. Most people would have no idea if you're a victim of identity fraud and theft. It's the FTC that has the lead on that, of all things. And when you go there, you basically get a checklist. They'll help you put a checklist together, and you get through all this stuff, and it's your job to recover your identity. For some people, it's a nuisance. For other people, that's nearly impossible for them to do on their own. And again, all of the harm that could happen. So we're turning to that. We're going to keep doing recommendations. We're going to keep rolling them up. I mean, the PRAC is an organization that includes a lot of individual IGs. And so what the PRAC tries to do is take those individual reports and roll them up and and distill them into sort of the higher level. Okay, what should we tackle, and what are we seeing across programs that we need to focus on first? Working with OMB so that they can start making those changes, working with Congress. They're starting to ask the same questions you are. So what do we do? What do we fix? Where do we go to now? So we're looking to get those answers together. Some are staring us in the face, and you just keep saying the same ones over and over. But there's value in that, right? People are talking about it. That's a good thing, and paying attention. And the amount of money that's involved is going to keep people's attention. And I think that's important.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point you made too, when it comes to, what do you do if you're a victim? I mean, part of my dream is that how do we shift this away from giving people what, tools and what they should do after they've been victimized, to giving them something that they can use upfront to protect their identity and better assert it online so they don't become victim in the first place. But
absolutely,
that's one of the things we want to explore today. Susan, I know we're right at time. I really appreciate you coming to speak with us today. Thanks so much. And, please keep us updated as you all are making progress, and let us know how we can help.
Hey, my pleasure, Jeremy. Thanks again for having us. And I look forward to, I'll be looking at most of them later, but I look forward to several of the presentations that are coming up. So have a great forum. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, now I'm going to hand things over to, as we're talking about how to help victims, as well as more statistics on what's happened. James Lee is the Chief Operating Officer of the ID Theft Resource Center. ITRC has been a great partner of ours on this event the last couple of years, and they are about to announce, they've just released, I believe, their annual data breach report, which, while probably depressing, at least is going to have some good new data for us. So James, let me hand things over to you.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. And I need to also thank Susan for her kind words and recognition for now what the ITRC has been doing for more than 20 years. We certainly appreciate that. One of the things we do at the ITRC is we do look at data breach information. And I'm sorry to say, it says the screen sharing is disabled, so I can't bring up my slides. I'm not sure.
Let's see if Dustin can handle that.
You can go ahead and try again, James.
Ah, there we go. Okay. So pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. Let's start out with what we did report earlier today. But before that, just the commercial announcement. If you're not aware of who the ITRC is, we are a nonprofit. We're based in San Diego, California, and we are here to help victims of identity crimes and compromises, as well as businesses and government agencies. With the whole idea, we want to reduce the risk and mitigate the risk associated with both crimes and compromise. And I also have to thank our partners at Sontiq for making this report we're about to look at possible. Last year, it was a big year. 1,862 compromises, 293, almost 294 million victims. Now, obviously, that's going to include some duplication because people are hit multiple times. It's also a conservative estimate because not every organization reports how many people are impacted by a breach. Sometimes they'll report records, sometimes they report individuals, sometimes they report nothing at all. We're going to talk about that in just a second. So if you break that out across the 4 categories that we track: data breaches, which is where data is exfiltrated; data exposures, which is available for viewing, available for misuse, but there's no evidence it was actually copied or exfiltrated; data leaks, which is information that is otherwise public but aggregated, usually through scraping and then kept in an open database. And then lastly, we have a few that we just don't know. We know there was a breach that said we had a breach, but they had released no details about whatsoever. So those are last year's statistics. Now, how does that compare to our previous years? This is an all-time high. 1,862 is 68% more than last year's 1,108. It's also 23% more than the previous all-time high of 1,506 publicly reported data breaches back in 2017. If you look at just the components of that, there were more cyber attacks in 2021 than every other previous year's every form of attack. So we are seeing a significant increase in overall data breaches, particularly those that are associated with cyber attacks. Sensitive information up slightly within the information that is released, still well below the all-time high, which was back in 2017, where 95% of every breach included some form of sensitive information. And lastly, to point out, before we start digging into the individual components here, supply chain attacks are wrapped up in those cyber attacks. But if you broke them out separately, that would be the 4th most frequent kind of attack, and also increasing year over year to the point where it is almost at the point where it could catch up to malware. Malware has been flat over time, whereas supply chain attacks continue to grow. There were 93 supply chain attacks reported last year that impacted 559 organizations. 122 of those were notices made about a 2020 breach at Blackbaud. So 122 new notices in 2021 of a 2020 attack. Okay, let's start digging into the root causes here. So far and away, cyber attacks, the bulk of the root cause. The constituent component for victims is a little short of 189 million people, but it's really concentrated in those top 3 vectors. It's the broad phishing and related attacks, including business email compromise. It's ransomware, and then malware right behind that. Then there's a big fall off, as you can see, including where there are non-secured cloud databases, but they are attacked, so the data is actually exfiltrated, so we count that slightly differently. If we go to the next, you'll see there's a huge fall off from 1,600 attacks to 179 breaches and exposures caused by either a human or a system error. We still see email attacks in the sense, or not email attacks, email breaches in the sense that somebody attaches a file that they shouldn't and sends reply all. You still see that. You still see paper files being physically mailed, not to the degree that they have historically, but it still happens. We're also continuing to see cloud databases with no security. It's not just as simple as They didn't put the password on the cloud environment. That's still a significant number. And of these victims within this constituent part, the vast majority of those are because of that lack of security on a cloud database. Move on to the next one. Physical attacks is our third category. Only 51 breaches and exposures. You do still see people stealing their laptops and with data on it. It rarely is that, you know, a targeted attack. It's an attack of opportunity. I want to back up just 1 second here, because you see here on the bottom here, other non-specified, 19 attacks, 34 non-specified under system and human errors, and then cyber attacks. Two categories here that are related: other non-specified 436, not available 106. These are all reflective of the trend we're going to talk about in just a second. What's the type of data that we are seeing? Obviously, no surprise, the top data attribute would be your name. That's the thing that is breached more often than not, followed by social security numbers, dates of birth, addresses, other kinds of health information. But then you get down to, I want to point out this next category, which is driver's license or state ID numbers, and to an extent, even bank account numbers. Those two constituent parts did see an increase in 2021. There was a big increase in social security numbers. We're going to talk about that in a second. But driver's license and bank accounts in particular also saw a big jump. Driver's license, because historically there hasn't been a lot you can do short of get into a bar if you're underage, or you can try to pretend to be somebody else to get out of a ticket or some other kind of criminal offense. That's been about the only reason you had a driver's license be the number stolen, and maybe they created a new fake ID with it. However, the increased use now of driver's license with authentication as a key component of being able to access accounts, we're now seeing demand for driver's license increase significantly, which leads to this point. If the slide will move, that availability of data does not equal the value of that data to an identity criminal. So we saw large numbers of social security numbers included in the data that was acquired last year. That does not mean necessarily that that's what they're after. It just means that's what they got. They already have social security numbers, you know, in large quantities, and that's reflected here in the relative value. This comes from a price list that's published by a group called Privacy Affairs, where they track the value of data fields, data elements on the dark web. So you'll see here, a social security number is only worth $2. That's because of the ubiquity of it. They're available, you know, more for a child's for different reasons, but still readily available, very low value. What's a higher value? If you got a selfie holding an ID, that's worth $100. A New York driver's license, just a scan, not a fake driver's license, just a scan of it is worth $80. If we had another page of this, you'd also see that logins and passwords associated with email, particularly Gmail, is worth $80. So the relative value is not reflective of necessarily the quantity of information that's available through these identity marketplaces. So $80 for your Gmail, $2 for your social security number, yet we don't think of the fact we need to protect that credential, that login, that password, to the same degree that we need to protect our social security numbers. This shows out the breakout of the difference between how much overall information and how much of it is sensitive. So this goes back to the statistic we talked about just a second ago, and that being back in 2017, which is the previous all-time high, that 95% of those attacks involve some form of sensitive, personally identifiable information. Today, in this past year, even though we set a new all-time high, it's still only 83%, still too high, but only 83% of all of those data breaches actually expose some form of sensitive information. Let's look at the trends. What does all this mean? So obviously this is the ITRC's view of the world. One good news piece here is the number of victims continues to drop. It's dropped every year for the last 3. So we saw about a 5% drop again in 2021. And the reason we believe that is happening is because, again, of the change in the threat matrix. The threat actors themselves are seeking different information and they're using it differently. Consumers are kind of caught in the middle between the threat actors and the businesses. They really want business they want to either hold them for ransom or use those logins and passwords, for example, to infiltrate systems rather than trying to go in through software flaws or other forms of malware. So consumer data still has value. It is the means to the end, though. What that means is, though, consumers are still at risk. Their data is still being acquired. Their identities are still being compromised, and it is happening multiple times per year to some individuals. So that's still excessively high, but 294 million is not as high as what we have seen historically. And there's every reason to believe that as long as the attack trends remain constant, then the number of victims who are individual victims should continue to drop. Ransomware attacks, based on what we've seen since 2018, this year will surpass phishing as the #1 root cause. It's doubled every year. There's no reason to believe that that trajectory is going to change significantly, even if it flattens a little bit with some of the bigger ransomware groups being taken out, at least temporarily, by law enforcement. There's no reason to believe that somebody else is going to just pop up right behind that and continue to engage in ransomware. So if that indeed isn't true, ransomware will become the #1 root cause of data compromises by the end of 2022. The new state privacy laws are very helpful. They're going to give consumers more control of their own data. They're going to give them more transparency and view into how that data is used. But it is going to exacerbate the problem that we already have today of where you live determines if you find out there's been a data breach, what you find about that data breach, when you find out about that data breach, and what resources you are given to either mitigate or recover from any kind of identity crime that might result from that data breach. These 3 laws, which will go into effect a year from now, meaning the CPRA, Colorado and the Virginia laws, when they go into effect, they will be helpful, but they don't meaningful close this gap of uniformity or lack of uniformity that happens today. So while it's helpful we're going to have these laws, we're probably going to see more this year. Pennsylvania has already proposed some changes that's being considered by their legislature right now. But the fact of the matter is, where you live today determines whether or not you find out you're the victim of an identity breach and what you get to do as a result of that. And it's trying. Okay. Breach notice effectiveness is low and dropping. But I think there we go. I need to back up here. Before we get to the effectiveness, let's look at transparency. Breach notice transparency is going down. We saw that a minute ago when I showed you those individual components about none of the above or no information. That's a problem, that we're seeing more notices with less information. And as a result of that, we believe that there are more organizations that maybe are not complying with data breach notice as they're imposed by state law. So hard to tell, but the trend line certainly shows a dramatic increase in less information being shared. That hurts businesses that rely on this information to be able to resource plan and to be able to figure out where do I need to focus my attention because I'm likely to be a victim of a similar attempted attack. And it's harmful for consumers. which we're going to talk about in just a second. The other thing, again, makes compliance questionable is just common sense tells us we are way under reporting breaches in the United States. There are 5 breaches reported on average, 5 a day in the US. There are 356 a day on average reported in the EU. The EU reports more breaches in a day than we do in 2 months. Population's roughly the same. Europe's a little bit larger as an EU, but that tells us right there, we are underreporting data breaches, which means there are threats and risks that are not being addressed. Now let's talk about breach effectiveness. The notices themselves, we did research at the end of last year at the ITRC to kind of dig into this. What do people do when they get a breach notice? And 72%, so nearly 3/4 of people said, yes, I got one. But what did you do? Well, just slightly half of those said, I changed the password on the single account that I was notified had been breached. But we all know from research we've also done at the ITRC and other organizations have done, north of 80% of all people reuse the same password on every account. So changing on one doesn't do much. The more serious thing to us was 16% of the people who said I got a data breach notice. 16% said, but I didn't do anything with it. I didn't do anything because, well, my data is already out there. Or worse than that, probably, the group that lost control of my information, it's their job to clean it up. They'll take care of it. I'm not going to worry about it. And then lastly, only 3% of people who received one of those data breach notices acknowledged that they did the single most effective action they could do, freeze their credit. So only 3% took the action of blocking the ability to open new accounts that involve their credit. That all comes down to the breach effectiveness is low. And we've never tracked this before, so I can't say if it's up, it's down, it's sideways, but it's low. And we need to change that somehow. We need to change that dynamic so people do take action. They do take these things seriously. We've all talked about over time, breach fatigue and notice fatigue. We're well beyond the point of that being an issue. We've got to do something fundamentally different now to make sure people are able to protect themselves and their identities. Speaking of, this is the other commercial announcement part of the program. We at the ITRC are going to launch a free service for consumers later this quarter, where you will be able to come to the ITRC. You'll have the ability to give information about accounts, not any account information per se, but who do you do business with? That if they had a data breach, you'd want to know about. All we need is the name of the company. So you enter the name of the company, up to 5. And if those organizations have ever had a breach, you'll get an immediate reply to that. But in the future, if they have a data breach that is publicly reported, when that is added into our database, then you will receive an alert that the organization you are tracking has indeed reported a data breach. And then you can come to the ITRC's database and find out the particular details of that breach. That helps because increasingly organizations, particularly large organizations, do not necessarily notify people directly. Every state law allows organizations to use an alternate form of notice, and increasingly that is indeed happening. And even when it's not happening, the information included in data breach notices, as we discussed, is wholly inadequate for the purposes of helping people really know what to do to protect themselves for a variety of reasons. Most often than not, they're just so dense, it's difficult for people to understand them. So we will launch this service for consumers for free. And then later in the year, we'll have a service that's companion for businesses where they can do the same thing for their vendors, because those privacy laws we just talked about, they all have components about vendor due diligence and the degree to which you must certify that your vendors and your vendors' vendors are practicing good cybersecurity to protect the information of your customers that you're holding. So we are going to have a paid service for businesses to come in and do the same thing, to track their vendors and their vendors' vendors as well. Okay, in the last few minutes here, let's talk about just the key takeaways. So in 2021, to recap, data compromises, all-time high, 1,862. That's a 68% increase year over year. Number of victims dropped for the third year straight. It's the lowest since 2015. Ransomware is on track to replace phishing as the #1 root cause of data breaches and data compromises in the US. And if it doubles, it will this year as it has in the past years, it will, surpass it by a significant amount. Data breach notices are containing less information and are less effective than they have been historically. And then lastly, the ITRC is launching a free to consumers breach alert service that'll be available later this quarter and later this year for businesses. Now, Jeremy, I see that there are some questions over here. So we've got a few seconds. Is that okay if I take those, Jeremy?
Yeah, please do.
Okay. So first one, how does that correlate to synthetic manipulated IDs would be interesting. I would think the number of victims going down would be due to the fact that the element of their identity was used, but how would you track this reporting? Very difficult. Yes. Always love when people answer their own questions, but you're exactly right. This goes back to, again, we have such a lack of uniformity in the data that's reported. It's very difficult to particularly be able to trend across states. But it's difficult to track individual data elements like what you're talking about. So is it a uniform breach, or is it a selective breach? And then how does that information actually get used? That's been sort of nirvana. How can you connect a particular breach to a particular then fraud element? Because we've started to draw the distinction at the ITRC between ID theft and ID fraud. Theft is when you steal it, fraud is when you use it. And this really goes to this point of fraud. Next question, the EU stat is interesting. Why does EU report so much more than the US? And do you credit the GDPR for that? Well, yeah, without a doubt, it is GDPR related. Why is it so much often? They have a very different reporting regimen. They have sanctions that have teeth. If you fail to report, there are real consequences, and there are uniform reporting standards. So a business knows what it has to report, by when, to whom, and what information. And then there's the collaboration on the next step of, does the data subject need to be informed or not? So very different, very different, regimen, but clearly effective in terms of generating notices. And so people are aware of what has happened with their information. Next question, with respect to the ITRC breach alerts will be available to Canadians who often use US-based services, will include transported data. It does not matter where you are in the world, you can sign up. It does only, because we only report US credentials and US data. So if it is a global breach that does not impact a US credential or a US resident, then that won't be in the service. But if someone outside the US is using or a customer of a business, and they have a breach, then yes, they'd be alerted to that. And then let's see, I believe we have one more. It just says, I think maybe you're asking when we'll be offering the breach alert. It's in testing now. We expect to go to beta in the next 30 days and expect to have it in full general release by the end of the first quarter. It's software, so anybody that's done software knows, it gets done eventually. Okay, now we've got two more that come in. Last year, the FCC proposed rules to prevent SIM swapping and port out fraud. How much impact do you see from these type of fraud attempts? Not much, frankly, at this point. They're also relatively new, so it may take some time. But it also is wholly dependent on the degree to which the organizations that are subject to that, implement them and implement them quickly. If you followed the mobile telecom world, you know that this was not a good year, particularly for SIM swapping attacks. It's not a good year for some of the carriers. So we probably are going to have to wait a little while longer to see if the efforts of the FCC have been effective in that respect. And then lastly, what communications are government entities consistently providing for victims? Is it solely up to business to provide alerts? Great question. It depends, again, on where you are in the country. If you're in Oregon, for example, and you are the subject of a data breach, then law enforcement is going to determine if you receive a notice. In most other states, however, it is up to the business who has suffered the data breach to determine if there's risk, and if there's risk, then does that meet the standard in that state for issuing a notice. So at this point, by and large, it is all determined by the entity that lost control of the data. That's not to suggest that they don't do the right thing, but again, when you go back to you look at the EU numbers versus the US numbers, common sense tells you there are some breaches that probably should be reported that are not, and it's probably a pretty big number. And with that, Jeremy, my clock says it's high noon. So I thank everyone for your time again. Again, thanks to our friends at Sontiq for making all this possible. And obviously, you can download the report on our website. And if you have any questions, feel free to submit them directly to us at the ITRC. Be happy to answer anything.
Great, thanks. And we'll be bringing on Tanya in the next panel right here. But thank you again, James, for a great, although slightly depressing report.
Happy to help. How about that?
Great, we'll just wait for everyone to get their cameras on. Great. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining our panel on pandemic unemployment benefits, where Franz Kafka meets fraud. I can't even say that. Thanks for the title, Jeremy. We only have a short panel today, so in the interest of getting conversation going, I'm going to do a quick introduction of our panelists, starting with Linda Miller. Linda is a principal in Grant Thornton LLP's advisory services practice, where she leads the Fraud and Financial Crimes Group. Prior to joining Grant Thornton, she served as Deputy Executive Director of the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, which we will definitely be talking about later, an oversight body responsible for preventing and detecting fraud, waste, and abuse of the $5 trillion in pandemic relief funds. Next, we have Julia Simon-Michel. Julia is the supervising attorney of unemployment compensation at Philadelphia Legal Assistance, where she represents low-wage workers in unemployment matters. She recently served by appointment on Pennsylvania's Unemployment Compensation Benefit Modernization Advisory Committee. Next, we have Blake Hall, who is the founder and CEO of ID.me, a digital identity network that enables people to securely prove and share their identity online, and also a big topic of conversation today. A former Army Ranger, Blake won 2 Bronze Stars while serving in Iraq from 2006 to 2007. Blake holds 3 patents related to authentication and has been recognized as the top veteran entrepreneurs in the country by Inc. magazine. Finally, we have Michelle Evermore, Deputy Director of Policy in the Office of Unemployment Insurance Modernization at the Department of Labor. She previously served as a senior policy advisor at the agency, and before that was a researcher and analyst at the National Employment Law Project. So before we get started on the state of affairs now, I was wondering, Michelle, if we could start and then go down the line, just to give our audience a little taste of what exactly unemployment benefits technology looked like before we got to the pandemic. That way we can see where it kind of went from there.
So I would say just prior to the pandemic, I think around 16 or 18 states had quote unquote fully modernized unemployment insurance IT systems. But the term modernization in that context generally just means move to the cloud. It doesn't really mean that that there was an effort to optimize claimant experience or really modernize in a lot of the ways we typically think about it. And so we had a majority of systems still operating either all or in part on 1970s COBOL mainframes. I would say prior to the pandemic, ID verification was not something that unemployment insurance did. In order to apply for and receive regular unemployment insurance benefits for regular UI, a claimant would have to, the agency actually has to verify with the employer that the person lost their work for the reason that they said that they lost their work. And so the employer who actually let you go has to verify that you're entitled to benefits. And so that's a pretty high bar right there. But as we went into the pandemic, and I'm sure as we're going to talk about here, pandemic benefits had a different bar for entry. And that's sort of what led to the mountains of fraud that started coming in.
Linda, being on the pandemic advisory committee, when you were thinking about how to counteract fraud or prevent it, or where waste and abuse might come from, were you factoring in what the technology looked like at the time, or were you kind of going in blind as to what might be the core problems here?
Well, as Susan mentioned earlier when she did her fireside chat, the PRAC is a conglomeration of 22 inspectors general. And so the Department of Labor Inspector General obviously has a lot of knowledge about how the state IT systems are. So it's not as though the Department of Labor IG was unaware of the technological limitations that Michelle just referenced. And I think the thing that's interesting is when you flood a program like this with money, that's when you start to realize just how problematic it is to have the majority of your programs operating on 1970s technology. And so, it's one of those things where it wasn't as though it was unknown. It was just that the scope of that problem was never realized until literally, hundreds of billions of dollars was shoveled out through those systems. And then you realize just where all the weaknesses are. It's kind of like, pressure testing whether your 100-year-old pipes work in your bathroom by, shoving water down it and seeing if it comes through your kitchen ceiling. And if it does, they didn't work. And that's kind of what we saw with the unemployment insurance. So the PRAC, certainly the Department of Labor IG was aware of those challenges, but I don't think anybody was prepared for how badly they were exploited.
Mm-hmm. Blake or Julia, do you want to?
Yeah, I would just comment that I agree with all the comments that were made. In one of the states that we support in the South, it's important to remember before the pandemic, unemployment rates were historically low. This state had literally just cut its workforce in half. And then all of a sudden you have this global pandemic where unemployment jumps up from 3.8%, to 14.8%, which is the highest it's been since the Congressional Research Service was tracking it. You have all these new stimulus programs that introduced tremendous administrative work. And then, as Susan pointed out, everything was based on the honor system. And that's where folks just took all these, socials and names and dates that cost $2 on the dark web and really just flooded the system with fraud. And of course, when there's that much fraud, it just really destroys access for legitimate folks. And I think it's in the same way that a hurricane with like New Orleans is a low probability but high catastrophic event. If it happens, that's kind of exactly what happened to the technology infrastructure and processes tied to unemployment when this pandemic arrived very suddenly.
I'll add that this is part of the kind of continuum of issues that we face as we move government services online, right? Historically, people walked into an unemployment office and applied there in person. Right. It was only in the early 2000s that we moved away from that to a call center model. And now most states are trying to push people through purely online applications. Right. So very different than somebody having to call and answer the questions of an examiner over the phone to take their initial application. And that really kind of opened the door to this, especially when states were just overrun with claims and did not have the staff to even answer their phones to take the claims of of legitimate claimants who wanted to call in and to do that. I also want to be careful, as much as I have issues with the mainframe systems in place, they were not necessarily at fault for the fact that we saw this increase in fraud. And I can say that just based purely on Pennsylvania, because we were operating on a COBOL system with our regular unemployment program until June 2021. And it was only once we modernized to a system that was the same system we had been offering for our pandemic program offered by a private vendor that we saw a huge spike in identity fraud cases, such that it went past the point that Michelle mentioned earlier, which was, individual employers can identify for the departments when fraudulent claims are being filed, right? Because they get something, they say, oh, this person is still working for me, or they didn't work for me, or things like that. But once you're getting 500 applications in a week from unemployment to a particular employer, it makes it almost impossible for them to flag that. So I just want to be careful that we don't blame this necessarily on purely kind of mainframe technology.
And Julia, coming off of that, as someone who works directly with clients and individuals who have had to go through this process or this transition, was there a moment when you realized things had just completely changed for the individuals you were working with, and kind of the services they needed had been changed by the way this technology was being implemented?
Well, I think the first thing happened when last summer we just had hundreds of thousands of people cut off from benefits here in Pennsylvania because they had been flagged for potential fraud. And trying to get people back onto benefits has been a real challenge, even now, for folks who were cut off from last summer. What we came to realize is that part of the problem was how we did initial fraud detection and flagging, right? What data points were being focused on to just identify what claim they needed to actually look at more closely. And then, of course, once it came to then trying to establish, what many of us, I guess not those attending this conference, think is simple, but proving you are who you say you are, folks really started to struggle. It's when you really come to understand how many people lack personal identification documents. And that's especially true when you're trying to access government benefits during a crisis, right? Many people at this time have moved, they've lost their home, they're staying somewhere different. A lot of their documentation doesn't align with their current address. And on top of all of that, they've been traumatized, right? They are in this system because they are experiencing trauma, and it makes it much more difficult for them to understand new identity verification processes and try to take the outside steps necessary to get documentation that is now required for them to prove their identity. Whereas for many of them, a phone call to the agency, right, talking on the phone with a human could solve a lot of these problems, as opposed to the multiple steps they're required to do in an online process. So we have definitely seen a lot of barriers for low-income individuals, especially a lot of our BIPOC clients, when it comes to trying to establish their identity in the variety of different new technologies that have been applied to the unemployment system.
Just one more follow-up for you, Julia. Have you, we're talking about an almost 2-year time span now. Have those difficulties changed over time, or are we still kind of coming up against the same hurdles as the beginning of the pandemic?
So they've changed over time, in that at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of it was about people being flagged and then having to establish who they are. Right now, identity verification is actually just blocking access from the get-go. Right? If you can't if you can't prove your identity, you're not even allowed to apply for benefits in the state of Pennsylvania, right? And so it's a very different process in terms of where people are being cut off. And so it affects people in different ways. There's different due process issues that come into play with that. But the core issue, which is that a lot of individuals in our country just don't have documentation that establishes their identity, remains the same.
Can I provide a few comments to Julia? Because I do very much agree with her that there should always be an in-person verification flow for folks to go through. And when we entered, and we support now 27 states with identity verification services for folks. There were tens of thousands of folks and sometimes hundreds of thousands in each of those states that were legitimate who'd been blocked by fraud algorithms at the state level, and the state was unable to parse the fraudulent applicants from legitimate applicants. And that had gotten so bad that California's unemployment agency, EDD, actually shut down completely for the last 2 weeks of September, where they weren't processing anybody. So there was a complete loss of access in that agency, shut down completely. And if you looked at the stats for California, there was a great government strike team report. They were only able to manually process 2,400 claims a day. They were getting over 20,000 claims a day. And you can kind of do the math on that. You never catch up. And that's how these folks that Susan talked about that had their identity stolen because it was the honor system were waiting weeks and months without recourse for help. And so, in Florida, for instance, there were these fraud algorithms that had flagged 52,000 people. And we were asked to come in to provide identity verification to automate, the process to restore access to their services. And we unblocked over 11,000 people. Mind you, like only 26% of folks tried to verify. So the vast majority were indeed fraudulent, but nearly 1 out of 4 were legitimate. And for those folks, we verified 86%, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, within 24 to 48 hours. And we got feedback from one of those folks in Florida, and she said, or he said rather, I just had the absolute pleasure to be verified by Tiffany over a Zoom meeting. I would like to say that Tiffany was the first person I spoke to in many weeks regarding being locked out of my account, who made me feel optimistic and hopeful over difficult times like this. Just having a positive attitude and showing a little compassion, goes a long way. And so when we went into California, we were also able to just enable that agency to reopen. They were completely closed. When Pennsylvania moved their traditional UI system, distinct from PUA, to the cloud system, they did not have identity verification in place right away. And immediately, those same issues that had clogged and shut down the system in 2020 replicated themselves right away. Business owners were overwhelmed with fraudulent claims. It was clearly unsustainable. We saw on the dark web just chatter skyrocket. And again, they said, okay, we need identity verification, right away. And so there is no talking about like access and equity without the fact that like these international crime rings are hammering the system with stolen identities, and they make matters complicated because agencies need to be able to separate those fraudulent claims from legitimate ones. Now, with that being said, we were very transparent when we went in that we felt that we could get 91% of legitimate applicants through. And in fact, even in that Florida case, those are like the hardest folks to verify. Like every single one of them who's blocked has some fraud algorithm or something from a records or data broker on them. And we were still able to get 86% of that population. Governor Newsom did a press conference on this as well. Every government agency we work with has an in-person pathway to verify.
Like I just want to, we could, instead of talking about every state, I just want to kind of look at the bigger picture here. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about how these statistics changed as you scaled up, we talked about this a little bit in the prep call, as you went from Florida and California and Pennsylvania to 27 different states. And, it seems like some of those same issues with systems being overwhelmed repeated themselves in the private sector. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about the realities of what that was, how your business dealt with that.
Yeah, sure. So the final point I'll make is I agree with Julia. There always needs to be an in-person verification option for folks who have difficulty with digital skills. We have always been an advocate for that. When we realized that these states were so overwhelmed that they were shutting down their in-person processes, that's shocking. That's not what we signed up for. It's not what we committed to. There needs to be an in-person access option. We've deployed one. Now, when it comes to verification, and I can talk as well, again, about why these controls were important to stop stolen identity. We adhere to the federal guidelines for identity verification, NIST 800-63-3, identity assurance level 2, and authenticator assurance level 2. So we are bound by those guidelines that are set by the privacy and security experts at NIST. And as far as documentation, we look to the issuing DMV for guidance, on extending expiration dates, which a lot of them did, because ultimately we defer to the government agency that has authority over, each particular area, like authentication standards, and so on and so forth. The most challenging thing about the managing the demand during the pandemic is that roughly 90% of folks at federal agencies go through a self-serve flow that takes a few minutes that can scale for forever. 10% of folks need to go through video chat. And it turns out at state workforce agencies, folks were more likely to move. And so that ratio moved closer to like 85-15. And so the video chat demand, is something that can't scale, automatically. It requires notice and training, just like states need training, and time to scale up their support centers. And so what repeated itself as a challenge throughout the pandemic was you had like Arizona, state of 7,570,000 claims in a week, went down to 6,700. When they saw the magnitude of fraud and how few legitimate applicants were there as a percentage, they sent all their continuing claims that had accumulated over 6 months for processing within IDME for 2 weeks. And so, of course, video chat wait times went up to several hours, but already by the end of December and early January, they were back down under 30 minutes. California then, gave us 10 days notice or so.
I just want to cut you off there, mentioning that they're under 30 minutes. Julia, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the wait times that you've seen recently. Just looking online, there are individuals saying they're waiting up to 15 hours at a time. Julia, as someone who works on the ground with this, like, does 30 minutes seem like an accurate estimation to you?
Sorry, just to clarify, well, wait time for what? Are we talking specifically about the IDME system, or are we talking about the wait time to actually get your identity verified as a whole and get access to your benefits? Because they're two very different things.
I believe we were talking about wait time for a video chat, but Blake, if you want to clarify.
Well, my point, because that's kind of a leading question, my point is that video chat wait times varied over time because there was excessive, like an extreme one-time demand to clear out like a year's worth of claims that had accumulated, but that those video chat wait times stabilized. And in fact, since the Child Advance Tax Credit launched on June 20th, the average video chat wait time has been 8 minutes all the way through December 31st, which is why there's no reports that are out there, about it, because that demand was both forecasted and sustainable. During the pandemic, we were getting, 10 days notice that 1 million plus claims are going to come through for California. And so, of course, there will be periods of time, and we have that graph where wait times will have gone up. But that was driven by, not only processing new claims, but going back in and clearing out, multiple months worth of fraudulent claims. So at the end of April, it was Florida, Nevada, Colorado, were all sending their year's worth of claims that had accumulated from 2020 to 2021 while those new claims were going through. And states were so desperate to stop the fraud.
I think Julia wanted to chime in there.
Yeah, sorry, just to get back to this. So Tanya, the point here is twofold, right? So what Blake's talking about is access to their trusted referee, the video process for trying to establish your identity through IDME. So 2 points. First, not every state is using IDME, right? So being able to get through to a trusted referee on IDME does not solve the problem for many people in this country, right? Second, I do want to give Blake and IDME props for stepping in to provide a solution at a time of major crisis, but as he's acknowledged, there were significant issues with scaling up that were understandable during that, where we did see incredibly long wait times. I will say what we're seeing now is significantly less, but we've also moved outside of the point where most pandemic benefits are available, right? So there's a lot less need right now than there was before. But that's not, even if I'm a claimant and I need to establish my identity and I need to use something like IDME, just because I get through to a trusted referee and I prove my identity and IDME checks off the box, you have a little verification thing in your account, that doesn't mean I get through to my benefits, right? And then it has to go back to a state agency, which is often operating completely separately from IDME and says they're kind of hands off, right? Like, we have nothing to do with identity. It's all a private vendor. now, right? And then you as an individual, often in a moment of trauma and crisis, are trying to figure out why the state doesn't recognize that you've verified your identity or hasn't taken the next step or how to get back into your account, right? What we've done is we've created kind of a brand new eligibility requirement that didn't exist in the unemployment system before, which is that in order to be eligible for benefits, you have to prove you are you, but there's very little due process that now goes along with that element and very little communication to claimants. I think what has probably been discussed, in different panels and will be continuously discussed is where is the line between communicating in a way that is helpful to people and sharing too much information such that you continue to support the fraudsters, right? Or giving them access to things that
I see you unmuted yourself. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, well, I think, Julia, you're bringing up a great point. So from my perspective, sort of observing what's been happening over the last nearly 2 years, identity proofing is sort of like, it follows the Pareto principle, I would say. It probably works for 80% of the people who have access to a computer and have documents that they can verify, and the variety of things. They've got a cell phone they can take their selfie with. All of these things work for them, and they can get into a system and verify their identity. Great, but it doesn't address the 20%. And I think what Julia is talking about is the 20%. And like I believe that the Pareto principle is probably accurate here. It's probably 20% of people that just don't have the documentation, or they don't have access to a device that would allow them to upload and do that selfie. They have mistrust of federal agencies. They're here illegally. There's a variety of things that will dissuade and or create barriers for people to use an identity proofing solution. And so while I think it's incredibly beneficial and has reduced fraud a lot, we have a long way to go as an anti-fraud community when it deals with government beneficiaries to come up with a solution that's going to address the fact that many government beneficiaries are vulnerable people. And this solution isn't a solution for vulnerable people. And so we aren't where we need to be, and we need to keep going. And it's not that we throw the baby out with bathwater. The baby's really good. We just need more. It's not an either or, it's a both and.
Right.
And I'll just that I completely agree on the 20%, and that's often the majority of our clients. But I will say that even the 80% that are able to use a system like ID.me, there are still significant issues when we add something like identity proofing to a government benefit process and outsource it, right? Because it's not fully integrated with the states. The states don't have a linear way for people to go from point A to point B to get their benefits when they have to go through an outside identity sourcing module. And part of this is it's all still very new. But part of it is that this is not in the law anywhere. There are no policies, there are no procedures. It's kind of the wild, wild west for those of us who are working with individuals trying to gain access to their benefits. So separate from just, can you prove your identity, when you add requirements like this to a government benefit process, there is a kind of a waterfall effect in terms of other things that happen.
Can I just talk for a second about that? What the Department of Labor is doing to wrangle these cattle out in the wild, wild west. I just wanted to talk very quickly about some of the stuff that we're working on that I'm very excited about. So as a lot of folks know, Congress allocated to the Department of Labor $2 billion to help state systems fight fraud, promote timeliness, and promote equity. And one huge goal of our work on this is to develop central modular technologies that states can use to build on, so that there's sort of a central code base. Obviously, going back to the 80-20, that actually also applies to tech. So about 80% of tech across states is similar. About 20% of it is customized to that state's laws. What we are working on is a vision to build, about 80% that states can use. They can take the code to integrate into their systems. In order to do that, we have to start with small digestible pilots. Our first pilot isn't that small, actually, and it's answering one of the biggest questions that states have, which is integrating ID verification in a smooth way for the claimant. And so our first pilot is a claimant experience pilot that will allow for claimants to log in, go through identity verification, have that identity verification flow smoothly back into the state system, and also make sure that the state's asking questions that are understandable to claimants. And I have great hopes for this this initial pilot. There are currently 2 states that are participating with it, Arkansas and New Jersey. And another thing that I would say about the Department of Labor getting engaged in this kind of work is they've never done it before. The most that the Department of Labor really did with states on IT modernization was offer states a checklist. So actually getting in under the hood dealing with the systems directly is a whole new challenge for us. And so it involves a lot of learning on our end. So, the state participation in this is very labor intensive on their part. So I just want to, shout out to those states that are engaging with us to make this a smooth experience for claimants. But hopefully at the other end of this, this pilot will have sort of a model for making it easier for states to integrate ID verification.
Mm-hmm. We had a quick audience question that I think would actually be really informative to this discussion. Someone was asking if we know sort of the data of fraudulent claims that come through online versus, someone calling up a call center or doing it that way. Do we have any basis of comparison of what overall going online actually means for fraud numbers?
Go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah, from a DOL perspective, I don't think that we necessarily track improper payment by intake method. That's something that I would have to find out and report back. Anecdotally, what I hear from state workforce agencies is that the fraudsters aren't generally likely to get on the phone. But I defer to others if they have different experiences.
My only comment here is that, fraud moves like water. So it'll look for the path of least resistance. Typically in-person verification and, spending time on the phone is certainly a less profitable use of time. So if they have a way to scale up an attack, they're going to look for the weakest link in the chain. And that's kind of consistently what has happened, that once, these rings targeted agencies and they got used to their programs. That's why Pennsylvania said, let's remove identity verification for UI, and then boom, like fraud immediately went right through that. And that was widely reported, which is why they had to race to move back to the identity verification that the Consolidated Appropriations Act had required for unemployment benefits. There's 2 points I want to make that I think are really critical, which is that the notion of outsourcing could be conflated with various things. Like the reality is that for digital services, the government has used data brokers and credit bureaus, for decades to verify identity. They continue to do that today, and the success rates through those solutions, are less than 30% at some agencies. They're demonstrably lower. And so when you come back to, you want to make the digital pathway as secure and efficient as possible, you also need relief valves, which is what we had kind of preached as well coming in. Like we're confident we can get 9 out of 10 and shrink this 15% problem, down closer to 2%, which you can handle, and then give that concierge service to those vulnerable folks that are most in need, and acknowledging that states often have different policies than the federal government on certain classes of individuals, like undocumented individuals here in this country, right? So there has to be, that balance between state and federal power as well. But, whether it goes through like a government system, it's going to hit LexisNexis or it's going to hit credit bureaus. So and Jeremy Grant's got a great, series of tweets on that to clear it up. The government has always relied upon the private sector to do this. Now, the problem with state workforce agencies is that 1980s technology and COBOL, all of our integrations with federal agencies are direct integrations through federated protocols like SAML 2.0 and OpenID Connect and things of that nature. Many of the processes at state workforce agencies were so manual that we would, need to verify and then send data over in bulk. And then they had all these like UiPath robots for manual processes, and then reviewers downstream from the identity verification that Julia was talking about. And so again, it becomes more of a matter of technology execution as far as how you can integrate it. And as these, workforce agencies were trying to integrate identity verification on the fly during a pandemic, there were serious challenges with their ability to support an integration like the model that we have at the federal agencies that are fully tied together, where there are no gaps, in terms of data transfer. It's instant, and it maps directly to the claim that that individual is trying to further. So I just wanted to add a little bit more color on those topics as well.
And Tanya, I'd have a really hard time believing that there was significant imposter fraud by telephone application prior to the pandemic and even during the pandemic, but it's hard to ever actually evaluate that, because part of the problem with something like the pandemic is that individuals can't even get through on the phone to the vast majority of state agencies across the country. And what that means is that you're actually then pushing the individuals who often fall within that 20% who would most struggle with technology to then have to file through an online system and go through all the requirements that come along with that. And so as we push people more and more through online systems, I think, A, you're opening yourself up to more imposter fraud, and you're also then making the application process and the verification process much more difficult for individuals who are already struggling with these systems.
Well, and I would just note, Tanya, that, that's why Nigerian, North Korean, Russian, and Chinese fraud rings, they took advantage of what we're talking about here, the complexity of outdated IT systems, massive different 50 different states trying to run 50 different programs with guidance from the Department of Labor, with unprecedented amounts of money, with unprecedented numbers of people unemployed during the middle of a public health crisis when everybody was working from home. And so, this chaos that we're talking about right now, that is what facilitated. And I think it's important to note that 40%, that's an estimate, we don't even know, it could be higher, of the money that was stolen from unemployment insurance went overseas. And it didn't go overseas to like France. It went overseas to North Korea and Nigeria and Russia and China. It went to our enemies. It's probably funding a lot of terrorist organizations right now. It's not just, oh, we lost a bunch of money. Our taxpayer money went to our adversaries overseas. And so this problem is massive. It has huge repercussions. And so when Julia is talking very clearly about the struggles, the victims here, the victims are the individuals who didn't get their benefits, the individuals who struggled to pay their rents, who maybe even got evicted from their homes because they didn't have enough money to pay. And we're also talking about, nation state actors, infiltrating our antiquated systems and using that and stealing money that they're now going to use for nefarious purposes that are of national security concern to us as a country. So the magnitude is huge, the consequences are huge, and the people who've been affected by it on both sides there's an enormous scale and variety of victims here.
Linda, I just want to stay with you a moment. One big question that we haven't gotten to yet that I think drives a lot of this discussion around modernization is how much fraud is actually going on. And I think a lot of people were surprised, during the pandemic to find that the federal government doesn't have really good data on this. And so we're kind of working through, combining state data, or ID.me has presented its own data. Is the fact that the federal government doesn't have substantial data on this a problem for solving the problem?
Yeah, there's a lot. Well, data and the federal government are two words that together create lots and lots of problems. There's just the data system is broken in the federal government and in the state government by definition. And that has to do with data collection, which is in many cases still paper and not digital. It has to do with data use and the limited ability of federal and state agencies to even have analytics capabilities to use data in a meaningful way. And then data sharing, which is a whole enormous problem in government, both among federal agencies as well as federal and state agencies. So yeah, one of the issues that the Department of Labor IG pointed out clearly at the beginning of the pandemic was there's a clearinghouse that was created by the National Association of State Workforce Agencies, NASWA, that is supposed to be collecting information that states can use to compare whether if they've seen like bad actors in one state that they may be acting, but many of them turned off those alerts. They didn't use those data sharing mechanisms. So they either never had access that could have been a technology issue, or they were so overwhelmed they turned off the alerts. So they didn't do any data matching. So even during the process, what data were available were not were not being used by the state agencies in the unemployment insurance program. So that's sort of like an obvious problem, and it was pointed out by the DOL OIG, and I think most states are now rectifying that issue. But the bigger problem, Tanya, is that there's very limited data on where this is coming from. There very little information is collected. Many of the states and the federal government don't have the ability to verify self-reported information. I mean, obviously the pandemic unemployment assistance, it wasn't required, which was the biggest problem. We know for a fact in the fraud world that not verifying self-reported information is the #1 cause of improper payments and fraud. Verifying that you're eligible for this benefit. We know there's going to be a ton of fraud. So everyone knew these programs were going to be high fraud, but in the, it was the fraud tolerance was up because it was a public health emergency and an economic emergency. And so, we accept as taxpayers that there's going to be more fraud in a situation like this because it's an emergency, it's a disaster. But the staggering lack of data that agencies have, that they collect and that they share, is contributing to this problem. And someone mentioned earlier synthetic identities, I think during James Lee's presentation. And I believe that a lot of the fraudsters that have stolen these identities now are going to start using those identity and pieces of those identities to create synthetic identity fraud, which is then going to they might give unemployment insurance a pass now. Now there's focus on that. The DOL is putting money out. They're modernizing their systems. They know they had a problem. There's a lot of other state benefit agencies that have antiquated software and lack of controls and and they're going to just shift over there. We're already seeing that happening with disability insurance. They're starting to see identity theft based fraud and identity in disability insurance. So it's going to be really important for states not to just, sometimes the federal government does this thing where they look at the one shiny object and they put all their money and attention. So it's like pandemic unemployment assistance was so bad, let's put all our money there. And it clearly needed help, but we can't take our eye off the ball of the fact that there needs to be a better job across the board of collecting data and enabling agencies to use data, and then data sharing, which is a government that's a statutory issue that needs to be addressed in order to allow the agencies to share the data with one another.
Before I jump in real quick, please, just to check sort of like sort of an underlying assumption here that we're not tracking fraud, that we're not aware of what fraud is, that we're, we have not been, we don't have numbers on overpayments in pandemic unemployment assistance. We track it very closely and are very concerned about it in the regular UI program. And so I will tell you that the improper payment rate for 2020, 2021 was 18.71%. Of that, about $1 billion, of that 78 billion, about $1 billion was confirmed fraud. The overpayment rate is 17.88%. The underpayment rate is 0.83%. It's important to note that we do very closely track all the reasons that people get benefits that they weren't necessarily entitled to and why. During the 2020-2021 year for the regular UI program, the biggest reason that people got overpaid, there were two main reasons people got overpaid. Number one was there was confusion about the reason for separation. Number two was that they worked in a week and didn't report those earnings in a non-fraudulent way. They made a mistake. I just wanted to clarify there that we do actually keep that the regular unemployment insurance program is very serious about integrity, but we are now working on a methodology to establish who got overpaid in PUA and why. I should point out that when a new program is put in place, a methodology of establishing improper payments it isn't required for a program that lasts less than a year. So we're only now, working out how to establish how much was overpaid to who and why in PUA benefits.
Also, just quickly add that the other issue with data here is that very rarely do we have good demographic data with any of this as well, which makes it really hard to fully understand the equity impacts, right? When we're talking about this, about who's getting through, who's harmed. And so it does make it harder in analysis going forward if we don't know the demographics of those who are both harmed as victims of the fraud, victims in that they can't get through to their benefits, or of what type of individuals are having their identity stolen. So there's a lot more data that can be used, but we also need to be really clear about the fact that we need demographic information so that we can fully understand and take action on the equity aspect of this.
I want to try to get to just one last audience question before we wrap up. And this might be a little complicated, but for whoever wants to jump in. The question is referring to British Columbia had done its own verified by video system that used video and it used text, and it was government run. The question is, why couldn't state and city agencies in the USA use a combination of text messaging, video, and identity documents themselves instead of a private firm? And I think we talked a little bit about NIST standards earlier, but is there, does anyone else want to jump in about kind of what the where there might be differences or why the US didn't go in that direction?
Well, I'll just first say part of it's a staffing issue. Like we drastically underfund these state agencies, and we had for the decade before this pandemic hit. And it's not easy to staff up during something like a pandemic. And it's certainly not easy to train folks to do things like this when they are working remotely. And I like you even said that, on the corporate side, right? That's a difficult thing to do. And so I do think there is this immediate thought of, okay, well, we could just have someone else do this, right? So oftentimes corporate hiring is actually much faster than government hiring because of a variety of different requirements and civil service issues. And so I do think there is an ideal world here where the states are engaging in that type of work, right? Do have that type of communication, but it's a staffing issue, and B, as Michelle said, that is related to kind of what technology they have at hand, how it's integrated into their systems. And so it sounds like what USDOL is doing could be a really great first step in figuring out a way for states to take lead on something like that in the future.
I would make the point too that it's going to be the same private sector identity vendors that are in there, whether the government is running the system or not. And the government was just simply unprepared to meet the demands of the pandemic on this 1980s technology, and so the reason why they turned to us is that the government needed a solution that was not only certified but objectively had the records-based software flow, the video chat relief valve, in order to get the maximum number of people through. What went wrong here is that the in-person verification relief valve that should always be there was also taken away. That should not be an either or thing. And the point that I would make is that government control should never be moved ahead of access and equity. You need both the digital channel to work super efficiently, and you need to provide relief valves for those who are most in need. And when we realized that the state workforce agencies were so understaffed and overwhelmed, we built an in-person verification capability that's deployed in New Jersey rather. We also support tens of languages, Haitian Creole and Armenian, things that other government programs, if you look at the language support for claims versus what's now available in identity.
So we've run over time a little bit. I know we could probably all talk about this for another hour, and certainly only scratch the surface of this conversation, but just so we can keep today's events moving along, I just want to thank everyone for their time today. Thank you, Blake, Linda, Julia, Michelle. This was a great conversation, and as I said, like a lot more to talk about here, and I'm sure we all will be in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Tanya. Good to see everyone.
Thanks, everybody. I'm glad we had a lively panel there. I'm sorry we ran out of time, though. It was good to have everybody coming, a lot of different perspectives. We're going to take a break until 1 o'clock Eastern time, and then we'll be back with the panel that I will be moderating, looking at, now that we've heard a lot about the problems, let's talk about some things that government can actually do to help. So grab a bite to eat, take a break, and we'll see you in about 14 minutes. Thank you. I will be moderating, looking at, now that we've heard a lot about the problems, let's talk about some things that government can actually do to help. So grab a bite to eat, take right. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you had a good break. I'm glad we're getting on now with the afternoon portion of our agenda. This is a panel that's focused on improving digital identity, looking at where government can help. And what are we going to talk about? Well, as much as we talk about identity and different solutions, government's the only authoritative issuer of identity. But the systems are largely limited to paper and plastic credentials, where commerce is increasingly digital. I think we heard a lot this morning about how that gap between the two is causing some real challenges. So improving digital identity is going to require the government, given its role in identity, to help close this gap. And this panel is going to explore what agencies are doing today and where Congress also might look to steer things next. We got a great panel today with leaders from both government agencies as well as Capitol Hill. So Jason Lim is the branch manager for screening technology integration programs at the TSA, and their lead on, among other things, mobile driver's license applications. Phil Lamb, an old colleague of mine from government, is executive director for identity at the U.S. General Services Administration. Tim Whaler is the economic policy advisor and legislative counsel for Congressman Bill Foster. And Katie Weschler is the executive director of the Consumer First Coalition, a group that the Better Identity Coalition has been working with pretty closely as the Social Security Administration stands up a new identity attribute validation service. So welcome, everybody. Let's dive right into things. We heard this morning how bad identity theft and identity fraud got during the pandemic, a message that was only buttressed by the picture that our partners at the ID Theft Resource Center painted as they described the results of their annual data breach report. And so much of what we're seeing is tied to how easy it is for criminals and other adversaries to exploit stolen identity data, because of the ways that we verify identity in the physical world don't translate to the digital world. But government's largely just been producing systems that to date have been made for physical. One of the discussions during Susan Gibson's keynote this morning about ways to close that gap between physical and digital was, are there ways we can come up with solutions where an agency can be asked by an American to vouch for them if they already know something about that person or issue them a credential in the online world? Phil, I know you've been looking to make some changes on this from your post at GSA. What's going on over there these days? What can you tell us about what some of the programs are that are in the works?
Sure. So first off, thank you, Jeremy, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to speak to you all and speak with the larger community about what we're doing here in identity. So what is GSA doing around identity? We've been focusing on identity for several years now. One of the things that we like to do is talk with our agency partners about what are their needs from a security perspective, as well as from a usability perspective. Understand what they are so that we can provide them with shared services. And because what we want to avoid is agencies having to sort of roll their own capabilities, which we've seen done and struggle over the past decade. And one of the biggest shared services that we have as GSA is login.gov. And as some of you may know, login.gov was provided some strong central funding so that we can really help address this challenge head on and help our agencies to handle identity verification. So login.gov was provided about $187 million from the Technology Modernization Fund because we see it as the one account for government. The one account that you would need as a taxpayer, as a beneficiary, a veteran, so that you can interface in a secure and equitable way. So that is one of the larger efforts we're doing here at GSA and sort of scaling that capability to all our federal agencies. But the other is what you alluded to before, Jeremy, about authoritative data sources. So something that GSA has taken a particular interest in is helping sort of advance that concept that SSA is doing around strong authoritative attribute verification. And how can we do that with other agencies, such as the post office, for example, with address, or State Department, perhaps, with the passport, and maybe even TSA with a known traveler number. And how do we bring together these different government agencies so that we can do identity verification at the attribute level, direct to the authoritative source?
Thanks, Phil. And Jason, if I can throw things over to you, some of the more exciting work in the space has been led by TSA in the States with mobile driver's license solutions. What can you tell us about the state of things there today?
Yeah, as you mentioned, Jeremy. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. As you mentioned, the transition from a physical ID to digital ID, that's what's really we're trying to struggle with and be able to assist the industry as they move to the digital form of ID. So as you know, we encounter over 2 million IDs a day, right? Most of them are physical IDs, but people are starting to provision their digital wallets with IDs. So how do we make sure that we can ingest those IDs in a secure way that we can authenticate so that the integrity of the data coming over enjoys a full forward privacy, as well as the ability to ensure that they are the correct data. So we've been working with Apple. I think that's a public one. We've been working with other vendors as well in order to build an ecosystem based on open standard by which we can ingest this data. And we have plans to launch a pilot with iOS devices, then follow up with Android devices by the end of this fiscal year across multiple locations.
Thanks. And is that going to focus just on in-person use cases, or is this something that could be used for remote identity proofing as well? Say with some of the benefits applications we were hearing about from our last panel that have been a challenge during the pandemic.
So the way we actually see the identity management space is threefold. One is the ID enrollment and proofing. Then we have the identity vetting. Then we have identity verification, which is what happens at the checkpoints. So right now we're focusing on ID verification at the checkpoint for in-person use case. Having said that, the ecosystem we're working on and we're participating with other stakeholders in this space will inform how that ID verification can also happen online.
All right, thanks. Kate, I want to throw over to you with the Consumers First Coalition. You've been a partner with Better Identity Coalition and working with SSA. Talk a little bit about what SSA has been building and how it's been impacting some of your members.
Yeah, Jeremy, happy to, and thank you so much for having me on this panel. As you mentioned, your coalition and mine have been working for the last about 4 years now, working with SSA on the building and the launch of their electronic consent-based social security verification system, easier to say ECBSV. So ECBSV is a way for financial institutions with the consumer's consent to get a real-time verification that a name, date of birth, and social security number are a match according to SSA's records. The driver is to significantly reduce cases of synthetic identity fraud, where a victim of this type of fraud is most often children or others with little to no credit history, whose social security number is used by a criminal to establish a synthetic credit history. And then over time, these fake credit files are used to actually apply for and obtain credit. And it's not caught because you're not really checking your kid's credit report for quite some time. So the criminal is long gone by the time this is caught. It's not that financial institutions couldn't do this verification prior to this system being built. It was just that it was paper-based and very slow, to the point that, quite frankly, it wasn't useful, especially in our increasingly digital environment for credit applications and decisions. So, by the time you got the result from SSA that it wasn't a match, the criminal has gotten their credit and they're gone. So in 2018, legislation was enacted that directed SSA to build this real-time system. And Congress did provide some clear directions to SSA. And, they specified the types of institutions that could access the system, that it mainly be financial institutions or their service providers, such as credit reporting agencies, and the reasons that you could be able to access the system, tying it to Fair Credit Reporting Act permissible purposes. And the legislation also required, I think very importantly, that entities that are using the system have to certify compliance with privacy and data security requirements under Gramm-Leach-Bliley. And it also allowed SSA to audit and monitor the entities using the system for that compliance. So since 2018, Jeremy and I have been working, partnering with SSA to make sure this system meets the congressional intent, meets the needs of the financial industry, that it's effective and efficient and secure. We've been working through so many different aspects of the system technology requirements, how you obtain the consumer's consent, what that looks like, the relationship of service providers and the financial institutions, and data security and storage and access. And SSA, of course, needed to make sure that those that are accessing their system are meeting the highest of standards to maintain trust and security. So they also developed a user agreement to help ensure these standards are met, and there's accountability for the users. The great news is the system is now up and running. They've had nearly 40 million total transactions to date. And there's about a dozen entities that are using it directly. And there's many, many more that are registered indirectly, meaning they're using it through a service provider, like one of the credit reporting agencies. And our work continues, right, Jeremy? Like, this is not totally done. We're continuing to work to make it sure that it's efficient and effective as possible. But I think that the bottom line is, I really do think the system could be a model for other government, private sector verification initiatives. Real-time access to reliable and secure government data is key to combating identity theft and fraud. And so that's really what we're thinking about moving forward.
Thanks. So let me throw this over to Tim now. So I think a common theme we're seeing in government, we just heard 3 different examples of it, is there's a number of different digital or digital-ish, I guess I would call them, identity initiatives underway. What GSA is doing for government services, what TSA is doing with the focus right now on digital options at the checkpoint, ECBSV, which is focused on helping financial services firms root out synthetic identity fraud. There isn't any overarching strategy right now in the government in terms of what government should be doing or how to coordinate these different things. And your boss, Congressman Bill Foster, has been pretty outspoken on the need for government to take a more strategic approach. So tell us a little bit more about where he's been working and you on this front.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having us, Jeremy. He's very excited about this space. Chances are, if you've spoken with him in the past 2 years, he's brought it up in some form or the other. And for good reason. It's a bipartisan issue. It's going to save taxpayer dollars, consumer dollars, aside from just being wildly convenient. So to that end, he's got a great bill, bipartisan bill, the Improving Digital Identity Act, which, amongst other things, would mainly create a task force on digital identity comprised of a few different federal agencies, the Treasury, Homeland Security, Department, Secretary of State, as well as some state and local members. So the goal there being that, we're going to have to talk with all these people to figure out what's the best implementation, and within, the hope being that they can eventually provide us some technical guidance on how to best implement a digital ID framework, what roadblocks there are, what statutory changes need to be made, and how to best go about it.
Great. Thanks, Tim. Well, talking about from a strategy perspective, there's, I think we talked about this in the prep call. Barack Obama, back when he was president, once noted the Interior Department's in charge of salmon when they're in freshwater, but then when they go over to saltwater, the Commerce Department's in charge of them. And, one of the concerns I think we're seeing these days with new services is that we could be heading to a somewhat similarly convoluted regulatory structure with identity validation services. For example, ECBSVs only available to banks today, but login.gov can't use it, nor can the commercial services that agencies are using to validate identity for government benefits. Meanwhile, some of the other ID validation services GSA is starting to focus on right now with its ID verification efforts are focused just on government, but not by industry. So sort of a broader question to the panel for whoever wants to jump in, although hopefully we can have a lively discussion on it. As these different services roll out, how do we ensure that there is a consistent and logical approach to how systems are architected, how they work, and then perhaps funded, as well as who can use them?
I'll start, if I may.
Please.
So first, I think it's worth noting that we're starting, though. I mean, that in itself is a big step. The work that SSA has done with ECBSV, I think I got that right, is really, honestly, it's groundbreaking for government agencies to allow that. They do it in a privacy-preserving way where they're not sending information out. They're just saying yes or no. And that sort of model, as Kate was saying before, I think is a really great model for other agencies. So, Jeremy, when you think about additional, agencies coming on board, additional data sources coming on board, if we can look at SSA's model, I think that's how we can, at least from a technology and privacy and a citizen consent perspective, be aligned, right? Now, from the, this is only being used here, this is being only used there, obviously, I'm challenged by it as well. But I think this is how government works. This is how government innovates. It's one measured step at a time. And I think that could be a good thing. We could accelerate it, of course. But yes, things that GSA does support our federal agency partners first. That's what we do. And as there's more value, as there's more need, and as the administrator sees fit to it, it expands out beyond that. And I think that could be a good model as well as we think about enterprise shared services with identity too. Let's make sure this thing works, that the citizens like it, that it does protect and preserve people's privacy while providing those benefits around identity theft prevention, and then branch out from there.
Thanks. Who else wants to jump in on that?
Yeah, Jeremy, I'll just add that, something that we're doing when we're starting to talk to other agencies about where this can be useful, is like we're really encouraging the agencies to talk to SSA about how it worked from the agency's perspective. I mean, I have the perspective of how I from the private sector of how successful we really think this has been, but we're really trying to encourage those agency communications. Like we've been talking to the Defense Department recently about their, how you can check active service member status. And that's a similar yes, no, there's some dates. So it's a little bit more detailed. So, we got to think through privacy issues a little bit more there, but there's so many common core elements of it. And it is a system that needs improvement. And we think that's another area that's ripe. So we're trying to get DoD to talk to SSA about how they've done it and really try to replicate.
Thanks. Tim or Jason, perspectives on how do we get a consistent approach across government?
Yes, from TSA perspective, besides the verification that happens at the checkpoint, right, using an MDL or DI, what we're developing right now is a risk framework by which self-enrollment of digital identity happens on your mobile device, right? Because we're working with private industry, private players who wants to issue their own digital identity that TSA can take. So we have to define what that means. How do we trust that digital identity if it's somebody, you, Jeremy, taking your own phone and interacting somehow with a back end of somebody who built, in order to assure that that person, that Jeremy, is that Jeremy that we can trust at the checkpoint using that digital identity. So we have a series of steps that we laid out with fairly prescriptive steps that we're trying to finalize in the next few months. That's going to create a baseline framework for digital identity trust that TSA can take. Having said that, part of that is going back to the source to validate that identity, right? Whether that's Passport, whether that's AMVA's DLDV service, or whether that's something like what SSA does, or as somebody mentioned in this comment, maybe that's where we take advantage of DHS or TSA's holding of trusted identities to do that ID validation. So to echo what Phil said, it is happening. And the fact that we are having this kind of discussion, thanks to you, is a great first step to, making sure all this come together at some point down the line.
All right, thanks. And Tim.
Oh yeah, I was just kind of echo the sentiments that, there's a lot of, I think everybody has a pretty, lay understanding about, the companies that are out there that already kind of, in some way authenticate you to a phone or laptop or that sort of thing. So leveraging those technologies and, fostering the partnerships with the people who have already kind of started the blaze down that path, I think would be tremendously helpful.
Thanks. I want to dig into privacy and security for a little bit. I think it's hard to get too far into a discussion around the government doing something to solve digital identity without that instantly triggering a whole wave of concerns around, wait, isn't this going to get hacked, or is it going to make me vulnerable, or what's the government going to know about me, or who's going to track me? All of which are really important questions. And, I think, one thing we've consistently tried to talk about in the coalition has been, let's flag those issues up front and figure out, how to architect them up front so that there's a high bar set for security and privacy here. So how do each of you think we can do that, on a consistent basis across government?
So if I may go first, Jeremy, with our implementation, right, which is fairly mature as a pilot. So basically what we're trying to do in terms of ensuring interoperability that really is built with privacy and security in mind, we're leveraging an ISO standard that was just finalized last year. So it's ISO 18013-5 that has full forward privacy as well as multiple layers of cryptography in order to ensure what you just said, right? The security as well as privacy. Additionally, we are also purposely choosing an offline use case. What that means is that no issuing authority can track your passage through a TSA checkpoint by having us ping real time to get, to assert, to validate your identity from some source. So we're using a mode based on the standard that, is the interactions is totally local and is secure. Also, we will delete your photo, both the live photo and the digital photo that comes across immediately upon match. And we have very short record retention for the other biographical PII data that's in line with the PIA that we have published. So if anybody's curious, that we just published a privacy impact assessment on the upcoming DI pilots we're about to embark, and that should be available to the public on the DHS website.
Excellent.
Yeah, I would just add that, just generally something, this idea gives you a lot more autonomy over your data, and also in determining who gets to see what parts of it. When you scan your driver's license, while your doctor's office may need to know your age, sex, date of birth, that sort of thing, maybe they don't need to know whether you're an organ donor or, I guess they do need to know your address sometimes. But to that end, you get to decide which parts of your identity are revealed, and it gives you. We can adopt a permissions-based system to give you better control over what aspects of your identity you want to reveal to which parties.
Thanks. And I wonder, Katie or Phil, if you could talk about the difference between an attribute validation service and a system that actually shares your personal data, and how, the impacts of each of those on, privacy and security. I think it's to you, Phil.
Sure. So I think historically, when data providers share and validate data, they actually provide you, the relying party, with the data slug. And they say, yep, Phil Lamb, this address, date of birth, social, all the things. They'll just give you that whole package. And what we're doing, and what Katie was describing before, is instead, we go and say, hey, Social Security, we'll send them Phil Lamb, Social Security number and date of birth, but Social Security will just respond back with a yes, no. So from a data security and a privacy standpoint, the data keeps and resides at the authoritative source, and only at the authoritative source, so that whoever's asking just gets a yes, no. And then so we reduce at least the replication of all of this data. So we reduce, hopefully, the amount of breaches we have and the impact of those breaches. And I think that model of how we do data exchanges in terms of verification and getting a claim back, if we can do that across at least the government authoritative sources as we move these into pilot and then into production, that's a good way to help both from a security perspective as well as a privacy perspective.
Yeah, and it's picking up on Phil's point as well as Tim's, as far as the consumer having so much control, right? SSA requires that consent before even that check can happen, knowing that it's just a yes, no, or if SSA has noted the individual has died. But so I like that the consumer consent piece is happening, that control. And Phil's absolutely right. And SSA has built into their user agreement requirements about how the data is stored, the one that's going to SSA, what the financial institutions are doing with that, and then also the result that's coming back. So even around those pieces, we've got standards and requirements that users have to meet.
Thanks. And as we look at more of, how to ensure sort of a consistent national approach, because we might see other federal agencies building these services, states, whether through mobile driver's license app or other, ties into their authoritative data, even cities and counties who issue, birth and death certificates. Tim, I wanted to ask you, one of the things I really like about Congressman Foster's bill, it sort of looks at three pillars. The first is this task force you talked about before, getting government together to think about how to take a whole of government approach. The second part was actually directing the folks at NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, to basically build a framework on the security and privacy and standard side, to set a high bar. And then the third element would be funding grants to the states to essentially implement that framework and accelerate these things. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more, especially I know your boss on the House Science Committee, which has oversight of NIST, what is the role that you guys see for NIST there, and why are they particularly suited to play a role? You may be on mute, Tim. We're not able to hear you right now. I'm sorry. All right. Well, if we're working on getting that sorted, Dustin, I'm not sure if you can help him on the back end. Does somebody else want to take on that question in the meantime? Or talk about things where you guys are already working with NIST and the government on this front?
As a also former NIST alum, I'm going to put on an old NIST hat real quick for you, Jeremy. But, if folks in the audience do not know, NIST essentially has provided digital identity guidance to federal agencies. Now, it's comprehensive enough that many industries outside of government have also adopted it, and many countries really look at it as kind of like that bellwether, very specific, with normative requirements, standard around digital identity that they all kind of strive towards. So I think, Jeremy, if NIST was provided that ability to think about the spec that they have today and broaden it out in terms of a risk framework as well, that is not just for federal use, but for private sector use as well, that could be a really great way to ensure that we've got standardization across the products and at least how we can trust the different products that come out there.
Thanks. And Tim, do we have you back? Your microphone's still on mute, but. Yeah, I'm not able to hear you right now. All right, we'll work on that with Dustin.
Sorry, speaking from a TSA perspective, we're actually already working very closely with NIST. So NIST actually sits on the working group that's drafting these ISO standards that's going to govern the triangle of trust, as I call it, across this DI space, right? So we're already leveraging the 18013-5, part 5, in order to define the transmissions protocol between the relying party like TSA and the individual with the phone. Having said that, I know they're also sitting on their working group that's working on the standard that's called 23220. That's going to govern the provisioning process between an issuing authority with a trusted identity and to their mobile phone, right? So NIST is already a huge part, and we are relying on them heavily to define this emerging space with their work as we go forward. And with our implementation, our initial pilots, we're hoping to also inform that process. So it's a two-way street, right? So inform the standards development process so as to identify any gaps, articulate any additional needs for that standard to cover. So to make that standard, once it comes out, as it matures, to be as comprehensive as possible.
Great, thanks. Let me shift. Katie, we've talked about ECBSV and, the work for the financial services space. How are you and your coalition thinking about ways ECBSV might be used to support other use cases beyond what's allowed today?
Yeah, Jeremy, it's a great question because it's so great that it's up and running and they've got, nearly 40 million transactions so far. But in the immediate future, I want more financial institutions to be using this. I think now that we've got it up and running, and the good news is SSA is about to open a new enrollment process. So financial institutions or their service providers, and starting in February, that haven't been involved yet will have an opportunity. So I think that's very helpful. And then, we've touched on this a little bit, but I think really exploring how else this ECBSV system can be used. Right now it is limited to financial institutions or their service providers, and it's limited to specific purposes, right? Tied to FCRA. So can we expand the use cases? Can we look at other industries that really would benefit from this, that that we'll have to adhere to the standards that SSA puts forward? And can we get other government agencies plugged in and start having this cross-agency verification? So those are some of the ways that we're really trying to think about where ECBSV could go. And, again, start also where we can use this model in other agencies.
Thanks. And Tim, do we have you back?
I do, yeah. Sorry, I think I was
Excellent.
jostled my HDMI cord here. Sorry about that.
All right. Well, I'd asked you a question before about NIST. I don't know if you want to go back to that or talk about, broader, models for attribute validation services. But, what were you going to say when we were trying to hear you?
Yeah, I mean, they covered it pretty well. I was just going to reiterate that, them sitting on the OSA standards committee, that's, they know they're the authority here. So allowing them to create these standards for us is what we really need to do.
All right, thanks. And one of the questions we had from comments is, what are your thoughts in terms of prospects for the legislation? It was obviously introduced last year. Congressman Foster held a hearing in the AI task force and the Financial Services Committee. What steps are you all taking in terms of, looking to advance it beyond just the bill sitting on Capitol Hill?
Yeah, absolutely. It's Congress is tough because it's, we move from fire to fire to some extent, especially amongst the pandemic. But we've rephrased this as, it can be a pandemic issue. There's a lot of the rollout of, stimulus support and that sort of thing, the fraud that we saw with that, and a lot of the problems there could have been alleviated with a digital identity framework. So I think that, just making this a priority for a lot of people, you talk to everybody face to face and say, yeah, it's a great idea, but then somehow this gets kind of swept under the rug when it comes down time to actually move this forward. So I think it's just a question of bandwidth and, people are excited about it. Members are excited about it. So, we just need to keep on advertising it and pushing it as a priority. And I think we'll get there pretty soon.
Great, thanks. Well, one of the questions I wanted to ask, searching into things that are coming into Q&A, it was a question for Phil Lamb, but I think it's really one for everybody to talk about, which is the EU has proposed the idea that every member state will create what they call an EU digital identity wallet for their citizens. That would essentially be, the backbone of a European digital identity strategy. And I want to actually go beyond Europe to say the UK has a national initiative focused on the UK Trust Framework. In Canada, the work DIAC's been doing up there with their Pan-Canadian Trust Framework. The Australians, somebody from New Zealand pinged me over the weekend that as they're advancing something. It seems like most of the countries that we would look at as our peers in the world are all moving forward with some sort of a strategy, and the US is not. And, wanted to sort of get your perspectives on, well, that statement and, do I have that wrong? Or do we need to do something differently?
Well, as it was directed to me, first off, I cannot speak on behalf of all the federal government. But what I will say is, Jeremy, you're not wrong about us potentially being a little behind some of our peers in the identity space. Though I will say, though, that there has been tangible progress. We are making real big step forward. And I think one thing to note, too, is the US government and the US population is sizable, and it is not homogeneous. And also from an agency and a governance perspective as well, we have some very strong agencies with a lot of assets in the space. And we all want to work together towards this. But bringing it all together under one unified strategy, I applaud the work Congressman Foster is putting forward. I think we would need real legislative support to be able to do something like that. It won't be something that we can just kind of do on our own as agencies, but that the desire is there. We've all been here in this space in the US working on this problem, some of us over a decade now. So we're dedicated, but it does take some time.
Any other perspectives?
Yeah, I always thought Phil was speaking for me, actually, but I stand corrected. But having said that, I'm not as pessimistic as Phil. At the risk of being a jingoistic American, I think we are actually doing pretty well basing our implementation across the whole identity management value chain open standard, so that you don't necessarily need like one issuing authority doing everything on the back end. You actually can have multiple issuing authority, including state governments, but private authorities, as long as you adhere to the set of standards that we can certify through some kind of independent conformance testing, as well as interoperability testing for both offline in-person use case like TSA, and in the near future for online use case. I think we have a fairly good basis to move quickly.
Thanks. One question I had too is, when I think about a digital identity wallet, I mean, is that another name for a mobile driver's license app, or is a mobile driver's license app a kind of wallet?
So that depends, right? Is that DI the EU is thinking of, is that going to be native to an Apple wallet or Google wallet, Samsung wallet? There are advantages to being native to a platform's wallet, right? In terms of security architecture and whatnot. So that's something to be discussed. Having said that, you can definitely have an app-based MDL or digital identity, as long as you adhere to a certain standard that we can also ingest just as equally and just as securely.
Got it. No, thank you. And Phil, if I can throw things, question for you, but I think really when anybody can jump in on, obviously where you sit at GSA and the work with login, there's broader discussion around how can agencies actually more directly support ID proofing in government services. And, this touches a little bit on a question we had on the last panel, as well as something that was getting a lot of attention last week with the IRS, where they rolled out with, a commercial identity provider who is out in front as the one that is getting, their data and validating things. But this was something I pointed out on, a Twitter thread over the weekend. There's things login might do that also might work with vendors. It might just be a government front end where you're still working with industry partners. And, was raising the, sort of academic question or philosophical discussion of if the front end is different, but, the back end in terms of the types of companies we're using is the same, how much of a difference is there? And so one, would just love to get your take on that, but also see if you could talk a little bit more about the vision, I think, for how government agencies as authoritative issuers of identity, can play a role to support ID proofing in government services, perhaps in a way that's different than what they do today.
Sure. So first off, absolutely, the government leverages private sector solutions under the hood of our capabilities today. We do this all day long, not just in identity, broader cybersecurity and others. And I think that's a model that we want to follow and promote. So that partnership between private sector innovation, bringing it into a public center brand or a use case, I think that's something that we value and we would actually want to do more of. Now, that being said, in addition to that, government is authoritative. And when I say authoritative, I mean, we issue actual identifiers. We issue them. That's how we're authoritative on them. So we issue these identifiers today to process and provide you with the benefit that you need, whether it be a social security number, a tax identification number, a known traveler number. We provide that. So we also have to be we government have to be part of that solution too. So bringing together those government sources, bringing in the best of breed in the private sector as well. So we're not recreating something or perhaps rebuilding something that's more costly or inefficient. We want to bring that all together. And I think that's kind of how we see the future of this, is a continued strong partnership between our private sector entities, as well as our public sector partners, whether it be authoritative sources or whether it could be going in person. Because something that another panel brought forward was digital identities, and I think I agree with her, that's an 80% solution. With the 20%, maybe some of the individuals that most need help from a government perspective, they might not have that smartphone. They might not be able to take that selfie. So we got to keep focusing here too, not just on the high tech, but how do we reach those other individuals so we can provide them with equitable access to government resources? And whether it be partnering with in-person capabilities or phone call center capabilities, that's something that we're trying to look at as well.
Thanks. Any other perspectives on what Phil had to say? All right. Well, we're almost at time, and our next panel will be coming on. Let me actually rip off something that Phil just riff off something, not rip off. Sorry, but riff on something Phil just said. That how do we actually make sure this is something that's equitable, that works for everybody? And I think this is a theme we've heard in some of our earlier discussions too. For example, how does it work if you've got an identity verification system for unemployment benefits that assumes possession of a smartphone and somebody doesn't have one? There's a lot of work to be done, really, I think, in terms of meeting the customers where they're at. How do we start to build identity systems that aren't architected in a way where we're going to leave a chunk of the population behind?
Maybe not as so much as a technical feedback, but I know that there was some discussion about using some of the infrastructure money. I know there's a huge push for expansion of broadband and that sort of thing, and that we had a strategy. It didn't end up happening, but to kind of create these digital ambassadors, and they're going to help you sign up for either MDL or better connectivity more generally. So there's definitely room for there's an educational component for sure. I saw a question in the chat about making sure that either rural populations or the elderly aren't left behind, and that's certainly something that's not lost on us. And to the extent that we implement something that requires the use of a smartphone, then we're going to also have to hand in hand try to get smartphones into people's hands. But fortunately, the security components that are required are now, they've been around for a while. They're pretty cheap. I think, an iPhone 4 or 5 usually suffices. So you can get those for usually $100, and the government is certainly, cognizant and trying to help make sure that that happens if that's the road that we end up taking.
All right, thanks. Other perspectives from the panel? One last closing thought from everybody before we wrap up. All right. Well, if anybody doesn't have any last points, I appreciate all of you taking the time on this. Great discussion. We'll take a break for about 3 minutes while we exit out and our new panel comes in. And the next face you see after mine will be Eva Velasquez from ITRC, who'll be moderating what should be a great panel on identity and the individual and inclusion that starts to talk even more about these topics. So thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it. Thanks for the time.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next session of this conference. This is the Identity, the Individual, and Inclusion panel. And if I could ask my panelists to please go ahead and unmute themselves so we can start this conversation. I'll go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Eva Velasquez, President and CEO of the Identity Theft Resource Center. And joining me today are our panelists, Burdell Lewis, Senior Vice President, Centralized Shared Services for Synchrony Financial, Chris Peterson, the founder of Penny Forward, and Reverend Ben Roberts, the Associate Pastor and Director of Social Justice for the Foundry United Methodist Church. Now, before we jump into the questions for our panel, I just want to lay a foundation for this conversation we're going to have today. You know, much of what we do in the identity, privacy and security space, it's designed to bring order to the chaos. And the goal of this panel is to help us look at how we achieve some greater identity protection without overlooking the fact that not everyone is the same. The way we use, maintain, and protect our identities, it varies among different individuals for a variety of reasons. Some of those can be cultural, or they can be accessibility reasons. And whether you call them citizens, consumers, or end users, whether your job is to shape policy or design actual software, these are the people that are impacted by the decisions that we make at all levels. And we need to look at all facets of this issue if we want to provide solutions that work for everyone. This is really important for government agencies. They can't choose their customers, but there are a lot of learnings here for businesses as well. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the privacy by design, security by default. I think most of us have heard that and hopefully adopted that. This is that concept that ensures that privacy is at the beginning of the planning stages and not something that's an afterthought that we address later. Can we apply similar principles to address the exclusion and the barriers that our policies and practices and systems in this space create for some individuals? Can we adopt a diversity by design, inclusion by default mindset? And that'll help us start to build culturally competent practices and service delivery. I mean, this feels like a necessary next step in our fight, and hopefully you agree. The reason this came about back in 2018, thanks in part to a grant by the Department of Justice Office of Victims of Crime, the ITRC began engaging various communities to do this type of exploration and do this type of work. And for me personally, it's been a very educational and rewarding experience. You know, over the last couple of years, admittedly, we've done a lot more listening than talking. And I learned things that I simply didn't consider and didn't understand because I've never had the direct life experience. One of the examples I can give is I was talking with a representative from Deaf Community Services, one of our partner organizations, and we were discussing how we could modify, change the delivery of our information so that it would be the most meaningful to this community. And she told me to consider that most members of her community learn to speak ASL, American Sign Language, as their first language, with English being their second language. And organizationally, we have many materials and we've received training on how to help folks who are non-native English speakers in this really complicated space. I simply didn't realize that we needed to take some of those learnings and apply them to our service delivery for the deaf, hard of hearing community. It was really an aha moment for me. And that's what I'm hoping this panel creates today for everyone listening, an opportunity to understand the identity issue from a different perspective. So enough from me. Let's hear from our panelists. I'm going to let them introduce themselves and we'll go down the line. Let's go ahead and start with you, Chris. Chris Peterson, you're the founder of Penny Forward. Can you tell us a bit about yourself, about the mission of Penny Forward, how it came to be, and even some of your other professional experience, because I know it aligns with Penny Forward's mission.
Yeah, thanks, Eva. I'm Chris Peterson. I'm the founder and president of CEO of Penny Forward. Its mission is to provide financial literacy education to people who are blind. I'm totally blind myself. And it's no secret anymore that there is a financial literacy epidemic in this country, and blind people need to be included in the solution to that. And that's why I started Penny Forward. I'm also just incredibly pleased to be here because most of my career, I've been working as a software developer and software architect, and it just happens that I worked in cybersecurity for much of that time. So I have been involved in design of authentication systems and authorization systems, and a lot of the things that we're talking about here today from that side of it too. And so I see both sides of the struggle. And I'm really pleased to be here to be able to talk about my experiences with that.
Thanks so much, Chris. I am looking forward to your insights. I think they're going to be great. Let's move over to Burdell. Burdell Lewis, I already listed your title, and I'd like you to explain that a little bit more. But I just want to say, Burdell and I have been working on a project, Synchrony and the ITRC, to better understand how identity crimes impact the Black community. Can you share more about your work involving identity and inclusion and why it's important to you? And I'm really glad to have you here because we've really enjoyed this exploratory project that we're working on together.
Outstanding, Eva, and thank you for the very nice welcome and warm wishes. I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to have this discussion. A big shout out and hello to my co-panel members as well. My name is Burdell Lewis. I am Senior Vice President of Centralized Shared Service at Synchrony. The role itself entails leading a couple organizations that have north of 600 different employees. They're enabling functions that really look at our digital strategy for our cardholders that we have in queue. More importantly, with regards to our discussion today, our interaction, quite honestly, is the byproduct of the $50 million investment that Synchrony and our foundation is making in diverse communities. This is where we're really looking to empower students, communities, as well as our employees in a number of different facets. We want to create pathways to college completion. We're looking to build skills for the future or assist with building skills for the future, as well as closing the overall financial knowledge gap. I think it's no secret that we all know, particularly from a fraud perspective, we're seeing an influx of different drivers from when looking at credit tools, when looking at auto sales, when looking at banking, lending, and debt collection. All of those are near and dear, but the thing that really strikes me closely, and I learned this by working with some of the collegiate institutions that we have relationships with, particularly on the HBCU side, historically Black universities, is what is taking place with our college students. And I'll try to be brief and very succinct, but ask you and the panel members, but also individuals who are listening to this important discussion. Imagine that you're a Black student and you received a great scholarship, whether it be academic or athletic. You get to campus, things are going well, you're there your second year, you haven't had to apply for any student loans or financial assistance. Something happens, whether it be to an injury, you want to take additional classes or whatever the case may be, you go to apply for a student loan and you find out that your identity has been stolen, or you have some significant or awkward detrimental things on your credit bureau, and you're the first one from your family to ever attend college. You're away from home, you're on a campus, and what do you do? Who do you go to? Who do you report this to? So as we have this discussion, I really urge everyone to think about when we have situations of fraud, identity theft, significant dysfunction from a financial economic perspective relative to credit bureaus and credit scoring and things of that nature. What are the steps that one would take? What do those stories look like? And more importantly, what is the outreach programs that we need to put in place or have a line of sight on to help these individuals?
Thanks, Burdell. I couldn't agree with you more. We've had many of those conversations. And last but certainly not least, Reverend Ben Roberts. I have to admit, I'm a little bit jealous of your title, Associate Pastor who works on social justice issues. It sounds like a superhero title. But can you explain to the folks listening what that work looks like and why it's important to you?
Yeah, certainly. Well, I'm Reverend Ben Roberts. I'm a pastor at a United Methodist Church in Washington, D.C. It's called Foundry. I've been here now 9 years in my position. And on my week-to-week work, I'll oversee things, from food service, cooking, distribution of clothing, teaching English classes, all of that stuff. But the thing we do every single week that has me here is something we call our ID ministry. The ID ministry that I work with is there, first of all, from like a theological perspective to honor the Imago Dei in every person. So the image of God in every person, each person's basic humanity. We call it the ID ministry for that reason. But what we do there is we help unhoused or homeless individuals and low-income individuals as they are going through the process of applying for birth certificates, IDs, social security cards, because we want to be able to, one, help them navigate what is becoming a more and more complicated process, but also to free that particular group up in terms of having to pay those fees. We service about 2,000 people a year. It's a little bit under that with the pandemic. We had to be kind of remote for part of that. And we have seen, 95+% of the guests that come to see us are African American, most of them from Washington, D.C., some from Maryland and Northern Virginia. We're talking incomes in between $0 to $30,000 a year in one of the most expensive cities in the country. And so our goal is like, let me just try and take care of this fee that can range from $23 up to around $50. Usually we see it on average right around $44. Let me save you that $44 so you can put that where it really needs to be. And so that's our goal. Walk with you in the process, free you up to really focus on the things that need to get focused on, and just get you off to a good start as you're trying to pursue things for jobs, education, and housing.
Thanks, Pastor Ben. Now, we touched on this a little bit in the introductions, but let's get a little bit more detailed about what some of these experiences for these folks actually look and feel like. You guys are all on the front lines of this issue. You speak with your communities regularly, and you may even have some personal experiences that you're willing to share. So let's start with each of you giving us some examples of the exclusion in this space that you've encountered, and then any suggestions you have on how we can solve some of these problems. How can we make some of these processes more inclusive? And I'll go ahead, I'll start with Burdell. I'll start with you, and then we can go to Chris and Pastor Ben again.
Eva, just a couple things I'll point out as I think through your question. I think it's no secret that Black people, the Black community, is being targeted even more, particularly in during this pandemic, as we try to get on the back end of that with more scams, potential fraud, and things of that nature. I think some of the scenarios that I've encountered, that I've heard about, that I've witnessed students just break down and cry about, is when your own family members steal your identity, whether it be due to the need of getting what I would call local utilities, heat, gas, things of that nature, or if it's more egregious where someone stole your identity, mom, dad, sister, brother, and purchased vehicles, got a credit card, a lot of different things like that. Those are examples of your question. But again, I continue to urge this group and others to think about, when this happens, what is the right thing to do? What is the path and or journey or programs one could take to overcome this challenge? Because once it's already happened, it's done with, but you're left there holding nothing, and you're looking to take steps forward, and you may be educated, you may not. And we see the biggest opportunity with our youth, meaning those who are at the college level, 18 to 24, as well as our elderly, right? So thinking those two populations, the elderly has been through a lot, very knowledgeable, may or may not be trusting. The youth has not been through a heck of a lot, but they may be very knowledgeable and willing to research, but what is it they should do and where is it that they should go?
Right. Well, they may be willing to do the research, but there's so much misinformation out there.
Yes.
How can they discern what are the best practices moving forward? Chris, same question. I know when we talked before, we've definitely talked about barriers and accessibility issues that I don't think everybody thinks about when they think about our standard practices, how you authenticate yourself and things of that nature. I know you had some things you wanted to share there.
I did, and I predict that all of us are going to end up saying kind of the same thing in different ways, because we have to remember that there are African Americans who are blind. And some of those, there's 7 million blind people in the United States, about half of those are seniors. So, when we talk about the problems that are impacting the BIPOC communities or the senior communities, or that intersects with the blind community that I'm involved in. Some of my personal experiences, one of the most recent ones, and it has to do directly with the pandemic. My state ID, and I have to kind of tell you that as I've been listening to all of the sessions today, there's been a lot of talk about driver's licenses. I can't have a driver's license. I don't have a driver's license. I have a state ID, and yet driver's license is almost universally mentioned as an identity requirement when applying for bank accounts. And a state ID serves just as well, but it's not included. And some people are going to read the language and say, well, I don't have a driver's license. This is shutting me out. And they won't even try. It's just the way it is. So we need to stop talking in terms of driver's licenses. And I would really urge people to think long and hard about that. Anyway, most recently, I worked with my treasurer of my board for Penny Forward, and we are in the process of opening a bank account for the organization, which is 3 months old now. And I needed to provide proof of identification for myself, as did he. Both of us are blind, and there were two things that caused us problems. One was we needed to provide pictures of our forms of ID, and while we have those forms of ID available to us, and we have smartphones, there are lots of blind people that have smartphones. Trying to line up your smartphone's camera over the top of your ID and get a picture of it that's got all four corners in frame and everything is a very challenging proposition if you don't have help. We are a bit lucky in that we do have help, but not everybody does. And not everybody wants to ask for help for something as private and personal as opening a bank account. The second issue for me personally is that my state ID is expired. I just turned 44 in December and it expired on my birthday. And because of the pandemic, I'm quite hesitant to take public transportation or rideshare services and expose myself and, more importantly, my family to COVID. I have a 2-year-old son who isn't old enough to be vaccinated yet. He actually has COVID right now for the second time. And so I want to minimize his potential to be exposed to COVID so that he can be involved in daycare and programs that he's involved in. And I also want to keep my 10-year-old daughter in school. That's really important. So I'm hesitant to go and renew my ID, which is an in-person process, because of the transportation issues that I have during the pandemic. Fortunately, I had a passport, which would serve just as well, but not everybody with a disability has a passport. Not every American has a passport because not every American has the desire or the means to travel abroad. And for people with disabilities, travel can be sometimes very enjoyable experience and sometimes not one that we desire or that we're able to do. I could go on about this all day. I have many more examples, but I don't want to dominate the panel. So I'll turn it back to you, Eva, and if you want me to talk about more later on, I sure can do that.
I'm sure we'll get into more of those details, but you bring up an interesting point because you're talking about those foundational identity documents, and that's just what Pastor Ben works on. So can you, Pastor Ben, talk about some of the specifics, barriers to access, and some, you've already talked about how the fees can really be a barrier, but I'm sure there are other things that you've encountered when you're helping folks.
So many things, but what I want to focus on is, where I am, just trying to access it at that kind of baseline, birth certificate, Social Security, ID card, just so you can get a job. What we see is that system for kind of verifying your identity is built and basically a white heteronormative way. So it kind of assumes that you're probably a guy if it's going to work for you really well. You're probably a male who's never changed their name. You're probably married and you have two parents available who can vouch for you. So that's kind of the way the system is set up. And if you've got that going for you, you're going to have a pretty easy time. It doesn't consider in the rules and the checks anybody who has some sort of, just a different family structure. I was about to say a broken family system, but it's not necessarily broken. Families don't all look alike, period. That's just how it is. So if you have one parent and you never met the other, then it can quickly backfire on you in the system. So for example, we had a guest who came through, a young lady, she lived with her mom in Maryland. She'd never left the DC, Maryland area in her life. She's 19, 20 years old. She spent her whole life here. But when we went online to try and apply for her birth certificate, all of the knowledge-based assessment questions that came up through the online verification were based on public information related to her father, who she'd never met and who lived in Florida. And so every question that came up in the KBA was questions about, have you ever lived at this address in Orlando? Have you ever had this phone number? All the area codes are from Florida. Which one of these properties are you not associated with? And so for her, she's just sitting there and just getting every single question wrong because it was she just never encountered it, never met her dad. It had never been a discussion. But we build the systems out in such a way that we're not going to, that story feels outside the norm, but it comes up all the time. Like I said, I'm serving 2,000 folks a year. You can extrapolate that out for the country for how many people encounter these types of issues. The same goes for kind of a more disparate impact upon women in the system every single time, and maybe that's more accessible. Any woman who has changed her name due to marriage and then subsequently potentially for a divorce, those are additional proofs that they've got to pull forward to get their ID and additional costs that they have to take on for every additional document. So if you need to go back and get a certified marriage certificate to show your name as it was, and then go get a copy of the divorce decree to prove that you were divorced and that you want to change the name, that's 3 more documents. It can take up to 3 more weeks, 4 more weeks. Sometimes you're paying per page on the court documents in addition to just the finder's fee, and it rests heavily upon those groups. And we see this, we see it every single week. So when I think about how are we going to help our systems anticipate some of this, it's just that we got to really expand what we think is the typical user experience, is how I've described it before, because how it's designed right now is not typical for the guests that I work with every week. So anywhere that there's family systems where it becomes a challenge to access documents, and I'm usually working with people on their worst day of their life. families end up controlling a child's documents for all kinds of reasons. We see it a lot with LGBTQ youth who have been estranged from their family and they can't go back to their parents, ask for the birth certificate. We see it for women caught in domestic violence situations where a partner has kind of taken over things as a matter of controlling, and you've had to exit that situation for your safety, can't go back in to get the documents you need to then build back up. So we end up starting from zero a lot, and the system is not always considering that as you're trying to answer those things that are there to authenticate your identity, but it's a real barrier and a roadblock.
Did you have a comment, Burdell?
Sorry to interject, but the spirit just moved me when listening to my colleagues on the panel. The most interesting thing that us as a community, a broader community, have to continue to keep top of mind. Normally, the individuals who encounter these challenges, they also do too in a way where they feel ashamed, right? You're ashamed that someone took your identity. You're ashamed that you're estranged due to your sexual orientation. You're ashamed that one would think you chose for someone to you chose to be a part of domestic disputes and domestic violence. And it's at the time where you're at your lowest, as Reverend Ben mentioned, that you really need this assistance and really need help. And as we look at these questionable systems, questionable processes, but large amount of opportunity that we have before us, I think it's also important that we keep that top of mind. The people that we're looking to help are people that are under duress, immense duress, and they don't have a lot of time to try to turn the dial to take positive steps to find funding, to find housing, to basically find information.
That really, the part of what you guys are talking about, and this really dovetails into the next question. We may have kind of answered it already, but the discussion around where to draw the line between security and the frictionless user experience that's a long-standing question or discussion. But we don't often talk about that security versus accessibility conundrum. And both of you really touched on it. I can say from my own personal experience as a woman who got married and changed her name, and I have a fair amount of resources and understanding about how these systems work. And it took me forever. I had one particular account that took me several years to actually transition to my married name. And when I think about folks that don't have some of those key pieces, the access to the foundational identity documents, or they are trying to not let an abuser know where they are or contact them or trace them. To me, these conversations, it's that whole diversity by design, keeping in mind up front that your end user is varied, and not just who they are, but the family structure, the community that they're coming from. These are varied, and we need to have solutions that I don't want to say cater to, but that allow for them to be able to participate. So did you guys have any other, and I'll throw this out to all three of you, just any other things that you want the folks in the audience to consider when it comes to the authentication, verification, and or even use, just the use of one's identity and accessibility?
I can start.
Sure.
One of the things that I'd really like people to consider is, looking at this from the other side. It's really important for us to design and architect digital systems that are inclusive of everybody. And that means that we need to include everybody in their architecture and design. I, believe it or not, have had people in the software development community accuse me of faking my blindness, or they're very highly educated people that have a great deal of difficulty understanding that I am also a very highly educated person who does software development. So we need to we need to make sure that we're including people on all sides of this issue. People, and they can't just be people that are like me. I'm coming from a place of quite a bit of privilege. I happen to be white. I happen to be middle-aged and middle class, and come from a middle class upbringing. All of these things, but we need to include people like me, but also people like the people that Pastor Ben are serving, that are coming at this from much different perspectives than even I can come at it from. I hope we're able to find ways to find those people and bring those people into this conversation, not just as case studies that Burdell or Pastor Ben can talk about, but being able to share our lived experience and say, this is going to work for me, this might not work for me, and also be able to come up with ideas for what might work in its place. I think that is going to be key to anything we do in this space, and that's something that should be familiar to anyone that has been involved in any kind of user experience discipline. So it shouldn't be new, but it's something that we need to put more time and effort into than we are now.
Any other comments, Pastor Ben, Burdell, before we move on to the next question?
Happy to go real quick.
Sure.
One, everything that Chris just said, absolutely. You've got to get the experiences in from the beginning. And so rather than just repeat what he said, I'll just say, you can come access my ministry any week that you want. If you want to observe in real time how it is people are interacting with those types of identity systems, you're welcome to come by here in DC if you're here and see it on any Friday morning that you want. And I think you just have got to, exactly as Chris said, and probably what Burdell's going to say too, get people's experience in up front so you can build the system around it with this and try and anticipate the types of things that people are bringing to the table.
Knowledge is power.
I love it. I love it. I knew you guys were going to have so many thoughtful things to tell us and to inform us. Now let's move on to the challenges. We all seem to be in agreement that this is important, that the diversity by design, starting at the beginning, is really important. But what do you, in your opinion, what do you think will be the biggest challenges for decision makers, leaders, lawmakers to adopt and implement this, this concept of diversity by design and inclusion by default, or any initiatives around that? I let you guys raise your hand, or I'll pick one of you. Chris, you want to start with that?
Sure. There's this tremendous tension between wanting to protect, I guess it's tension in three ways. Wanting to protect the individual from a government's perspective, or maybe a business's perspective. It's wanting to protect themselves, the business or government entity, from fraud. And then wanting to make sure that everybody is able to access the resources that the government or business entity is trying to offer. And trying to strike that balance is incredibly important. I've personally been involved in efforts where we've gone way too far towards, or we started out from a position of going way too far towards protecting the business and providing a poor experience for the individual. And even the individuals might be current customers of that business. On the other hand, we heard earlier from James Lee that identity crimes and fraud are a big issue, and it's a growing issue. It's not a whatever the opposite of growing. It's not a waning issue. So, you know, we have to do something. We have to do something to protect all sides of these transactions. But when we're doing that, we also need to keep in mind that the something that we do cannot be a one-size-fits-all solution. There need to be lots of different options, lots of different ways to access identity proving services, so that if somebody isn't technologically savvy, they can access an in-person service or a telephone or a video verification service. We also need to have really good online systems because, you know, for somebody like me who is a technical person and has transportation concerns, I'd much rather do something online, especially if it works great and if it's streamlined, than do something in person. But I can tell you that I've worked with seniors or people that are dealing with multiple disabilities who aren't able to use those things the way that I can, and that doesn't make them less of a person. Their need for the things that we all need is equally valid, and whatever policies we put in place, we need to make sure that everybody's included in those policies.
Ben, Burdell, do you guys have anything to add?
Yeah, I'll quickly say, and I agree with everything that he mentioned. But as I think about it, I think it really takes two or three things. One being awareness, right? Typically, people are not aware, and a lot of times our leaders are not aware until it happens to them or the problem is put right before them, right? And then now there is an urgency or level and intensity around it where it's, what do I do? What can I do to help? What can I do to get out of this? And I think that takes me to step two. It's around education, right? And this goes into whether it be digital education. We're most definitely living in the middle of a very social environment. When you look at all the different social platforms out there, it's funny, as we were talking today, I was thinking about all the credit bureau agencies that you can go to get your credit score and get identifiers of what's taking place from a financial well-being. 5-10 years ago, that wasn't there. So when we look at some of these fraud challenges and scam artists and different things, identity theft, how can we create more awareness and more education around it? And which takes me to the last piece that was just mentioned by Chris is more inclusion, or what I would call people being transparent, right? That this is important. We're not going to stand for it, and we're going to put some things in place to try to do away with it. Would be my take.
I would just add, as system builders, policymakers are thinking about things, is to continually ask the question, like, is this absolutely necessary? Because we kind of build out some of these security apparatus and we keep things around that maybe aren't completely necessary. So from where I am, the less I have to do to get somebody their basic document, the better. So if you happen to see something that is not absolutely necessary for someone to have to go through, like, get rid of it, please. And then if you are there and you're actually pulling in folks at the beginning and you're thinking about the different experiences, part of that diversity of experience is income. And so I think a challenge, especially in sort of the climate that we've got, is this sort of fee for service from government agencies. And the longer I'm doing this and I look at fee for service from a government agency on a document that the public is requiring you to have to participate in the community, I'm like, it doesn't look like we fully funded this government agency, and they're having to operate by pulling in fees from people while giving them back a document we're requiring them to have, which means, come and play, but pay me for the privilege. That doesn't work for folks when I don't want I don't want their income going in that direction. I want their income going into something for their family, something entrepreneurial, something to support their community in a wider way, not just to get step one done so they can then try and re-enter the community. So I'm like, but that's a huge challenge. I don't see us fully funding agencies like immigration, customs, and service, where, as I was mentioning in some of our written correspondence, if you need to replace a green card in order to prove that you're here legally in order to get another document, that's a close to $500 charge right away just to get one document to then get the next. And that's a lot. That's a lot for any of us.
Well, and you know what you bring up, I'm going to jump to the last question because we're coming up on time. So really just some of your last thoughts about the myths around accessing or using the either technology, some of these systems by the different populations that you guys work with, because I think there are plenty of them out there, and that might just give some insight for people. I'll go ahead, Ben, let's start with you again.
Would you mind just saying that one more time?
Just in my mind, when I think about, there's some myths around accessibility, barriers to accessibility, and how different populations either use technology or use our identity verification services. And I'll say this in a very inartful way, but there may be a lot of folks that think, why would a homeless person need their birth certificate? Why would a homeless person need to authenticate themselves online? I think that's a myth. Are there any other myths out there that you'd like to dispel about the need and use of these different the technologies and authentication and verification?
Sure. And I'll take your hypothetical and then I'll keep going. The reason that my folks have to access the birth certificate, the social security card, you've got to build all of those documents together before you can go and ask for your non-driver's ID from the DMV. You got to get all that stuff in order first because of the Real ID Act. So now my folks lose their documents because of here in DC, the tent encampment clearances. People like the city will come and like throw away your items off of the street. Sometimes your vital documents are in there. Your stuff will get rained on, snowed on, stolen if you happen to be sleeping out, sometimes in the shelters as well. So our folks lose documents for all kinds of reasons. Evictions is another one. So as they're building back, I work with a lot of, when we talk about the system and how it's a bit inaccessible, I work with a lot of people with substance abuse challenges. I work with a lot of people with some mental health issues or intellectual disabilities. And when you get into a software system, like a knowledge-based quiz on the VitalCheck KBA, you're getting questions that are like kind of negative questions. Which one of these addresses have you never been associated with? And my people did a good job just to get in the door to see me, to then be met with questions that are kind of intentionally confusing. And then you're failing that. And let's say you did manage to pass the KBA in the first place, you've still got another 4-5 steps ahead of you after you leave the church to try and make it to Social Security office, Vital Statistic office, Department of Motor Vehicles on a time frame that is now 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks for each of those things to happen. That's a ton. That is a Herculean effort just to get your document done. That's a massive barrier of participation because, again, the goal here, and I think the thing we all want to see is you are housed, you are working and supporting yourself or your family, and you have got your kids in the schools where they need to be. But when we build our systems in such a way that we're not giving a lot of attention to how challenging it can be for what are sometimes considered subsets of the population, we're locking folks out, and we're locking folks out for sometimes years on end.
Well, gentlemen, we are actually at time, but I do want to give Chris and Burdell 30 seconds for your final thoughts.
So my final thought is everything Pastor Ben just said is equally applicable to people with disabilities, many of whom are making $849 a month on Social Security benefits if they can get them because they have the right ID to qualify for that. Many of those people don't want to be receiving benefits. They want to get off of those and find jobs. And you need to have all of this identity documentation in order to get a job. And it's hard enough for someone with a disability to get a job offer in the first place. Let's make it easy for them to accept it.
Thanks, Chris. Burdell, 30 seconds, final thoughts, and then I'll hand it back to Jeremy.
Faster than that, Eva. I think the one word I would like to leave everyone with is compassion. Compassion for your neighbors, compassion for others, everyone who finds themselves in a scenario that we've talked about today. And we've provided several examples. It's not always their fault. And in my experience, typically 99.9% of them do not want to be in the position that they're in. And that's when the one word again comes top of mind, compassion. Please have compassion as you walk through the changes that you can potentially make, how we interact and deal with others, but also the thought leadership that's needed around our future.
I think that's a great note to end on, compassion. And Jeremy, with that, I will hand it back to you.
Thanks. Really appreciate it. Chris, Pastor Ben, Burdell, Eva, thank you so much for taking the time to speak. I had, for those who aren't looking in the chat, I had also posted a link to Founder United Methodist Church, if anybody's interested in supporting the work that Pastor Ben and his team does. But beyond financial contributions, I'd also urge you to get in touch with him and look to volunteer. I've spent some time there. As somebody who's come at this from the security perspective early in my career, it really changed how I think about identity systems and helped to get me thinking about some of the topics we've been talking about today. The other point I'll just flag is, to me personally, one of the questions that also got me asking as I see the work that they're doing, which is incredibly inspirational, is as a fellow resident of Washington, D.C., why do I have to depend on a bunch of volunteers at a church to get this assistance? Why is this not something that the city itself is able to help in? And I think as we've started to explore this topic a little bit in the Better Identity Coalition, we've learned there aren't many jurisdictions that actually offer people help. One of the things that's emerged from this, we heard Tim Weiler talk before about Congressman Foster's bill, which is a bipartisan bill, the Improving Digital Identity Act. Congressman Foster and Langevin and the Democratic side teamed up with Congressman Katko and Loudermilk Republicans, but there's an element of that if grants were to go forward to states to invest in digital identity systems, 10% of it will be put aside to help people who are in a situation where they can't easily get an ID. And so, not that we've gotten that bill passed into law yet, but I've been happy we've actually been able to get bipartisan support on the Hill for what to me seems like it should be a very nonpartisan, common sense, provision, but clearly something that has not been getting attention from governments across the country. So I really thank all of you for coming to talk today about things. In terms of just giving you a preview of what's next tomorrow, this does end what we had today. And thanks to everybody for hanging in with us. I know it's not easy on Zoom. We've got tomorrow, we'll kick off at 11 o'clock Eastern time with a keynote from Eric Mill from the White House. He's a senior advisor to the federal CIO. He'll be talking about government zero trust strategy and the future of strong authentication. Andrew Shikiar from FIDO Alliance will be giving a keynote there that I think will probably complement and fill out some of the things that Eric has to talk about. And then we'll have a panel on the authentication topic just before lunch. The afternoon, we're going to talk about a topic that, among other things, I think is getting quite a bit of attention these days, which is what is the role of artificial intelligence in some next generation identity proofing systems. We've got a great panel there of folks from industry and government, a spotlight session from the Chief Innovation Officer, Sultan Megji at the FDIC, and Kay Turner, who leads digital identity efforts at FinCEN, on the new FinTech sprint that they've announced on looking at measuring effectiveness of digital ID proofing tools, and a closing keynote from Elizabeth Rosenberg, who was recently confirmed as the Treasury Assistant Secretary, overseeing, among other things, making sure the financial system is not used I guess what I would say, bad people to do bad things, but there's a broader set of issues I think they're looking at there as well in terms of how to balance those issues along with, some of the inclusion and equity, concerns we've just talked about today. So with that, thanks to everybody who hung in here with us. Thanks also to Dustin Loop, our extraordinary producer who makes all the magic happen behind the scenes and makes this look pretty good. And we'll see you all tomorrow. Thank you again.